Before we begin tonight's story, I want to ask for your support in a few quick ways. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference and helps others discover these stories. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy what we do here, please consider subscribing. It means everything. I also want to give a thank you to Jeffernon and Tweety for suggesting tonight's topic. The Black-Eyed Children phenomenon is one of those stories that gets under your skin and stays there, and you guys knew exactly what would make for a compelling investigation. This one's for you. Now, let's get into tonight's story. There are certain encounters that do not announce themselves with violence or force. They arrive quietly, politely even, and they wait. They do not break down doors, they do not shatter windows. They simply stand there, in the dark, and ask a single question. Can I come in? The most disturbing part is not always what we see. Sometimes it is what we're asked to do. And in the case of the Black-Eyed Children, the terror lies not in their appearance alone, but in the choice they place before you. Because no matter how wrong they feel, no matter how deep the dread that crawls up your spine, they will not enter unless you let them. This is not a story about monsters that hunt. It is a story about something far stranger, something that follows rules, something that waits for permission. And tonight, we're going to walk through the most documented encounters, the patterns that have emerged over decades, and the question that no one has been able to answer. What are they, and why do they need to be invited in? Before we dive in, I want to give a huge thank you to Jeff, Anon and Tweety for suggesting this topic. This one's for you. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The First Modern Case. The year was 1996. The place was Abilene, Texas, a mid-sized city in the western part of the state, known more for its universities and quiet neighborhoods than for anything unusual. It was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. But that winter, something happened that would ripple outward into the collective consciousness of the internet, spawning thousands of similar reports and launching one of the most persistent modern conspiracy theories. The witness was a man named Brian Bethel. He was a journalist, a reporter for the Abilene Reporter-News, someone trained to observe and document the world around him with clarity and skepticism. He was not the type to fabricate stories or exaggerate for effect. His profession depended on credibility. His colleagues knew him as methodical, detail-oriented, and grounded in facts. And yet, what he described that night would challenge everything he thought he understood about the world. It was late evening on January 16th. Bethel had driven to a local shopping centre near the intersection of North 1st Street and Hickory Street to drop off a payment in the after-hours deposit box outside a movie theatre. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit only by a few scattered streetlights casting pools of yellow light across the asphalt. He parked his car near the entrance and was preparing to step out when he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Two figures were walking toward him. At first, he assumed they were just kids, perhaps waiting for a ride after a late movie showing. It was not unusual to see children out in public spaces, even at night. But as they approached, something about their movement felt wrong. They did not walk the way children usually walk. There was no hesitation, no playfulness, no distraction. Their pace was steady, deliberate, and they were heading directly toward his car with purpose that seemed unnatural for their apparent age. Bethel rolled down his window slightly, thinking perhaps they needed help. The older of the two, a boy who appeared to be around 12 or 13 years old, stepped forward and spoke. He wore a simple hooded sweatshirt and jeans, clothing that seemed slightly too thin for the winter evening. His companion, who looked perhaps 9 or 10, stood silently beside him, hands at his sides. His voice was calm, too calm. He asked if they could have a ride home. He explained that they had been walking for a while and needed to get back to their house to retrieve something they had forgotten. He did not specify what. He did not explain where they had been or why they were out so late without adult supervision. His tone was polite but strangely flat, as if reading from a script he had memorized but did not understand. Bethel felt his body tense. He could not explain why. On the surface, the request seemed reasonable enough. Kids asking for help was not unusual, but every instinct in his body was screaming at him to refuse. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. His breathing quickened. He felt a wave of nausea rising in his chest, a physical reaction that seemed disproportionate to the situation. And then he looked at their faces more carefully. Chapter 2. The Eyes. At first, Bethel could not place what was wrong. The boys looked ordinary enough on the surface. They wore casual clothing, nothing remarkable or out of place. Their posture was neutral, neither threatening nor particularly friendly. Their expressions were blank, showing no emotion whatsoever. But something about their faces felt off, like a photograph that had been slightly altered, in a way you could not quite identify but knew was wrong. Then the older boy shifted slightly, and the light from the street lamp caught his face at a different angle. Bethel saw their eyes. They were completely black, not dark brown, not shadowed by the hood, not hidden by contact lenses or theatrical makeup. Just black. Solid, uniform black, from edge to edge. No whites, no irises, no pupils. Just an endless void where eyes should have been, as if someone had taken an ink pen and coloured in the entire surface of the eye, leaving no trace of normal human anatomy. Bethel described the sensation as immediate and overwhelming. It was not simply fear. It was a primal, instinctive terror that bypassed rational thought entirely. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. His stomach turned violently. Cold sweat broke out across his skin despite the winter chill. He felt the urge to flee, to get as far away from those children as possible, even though they had done nothing overtly threatening. It was the same feeling prey animals must experience when they sense a predator, an ancient warning, system that has kept humans alive for thousands of years. The older boy continued speaking. He repeated the request, but his phrasing changed slightly. He said they needed to come inside the car, not asking if they could, stating that they needed to. He did not raise his voice. He did not move closer, but there was an insistence in his tone now, a subtle pressure that felt more like a command than a question. The younger boy still had not spoken, but his black eyes were fixed on Bethel with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Bethel found himself reaching for the door lock, his hand moving almost automatically. Some part of his mind was considering letting them in, rationalization beginning to form. They were just kids. They needed help. What harm could it do? But another part of his mind, the part connected to that ancient survival instinct, was shouting warnings. He shook his head. He stammered something about not being able to help, about being in a hurry, about needing to leave. The words came out jumbled and incoherent, but he got the message across. The boy did not react with anger or frustration. He did not plead or explain further. He simply stared. Both of them stared. And in that moment, Bethel became acutely aware of how vulnerable he was. He was sitting in a stationary vehicle with the window cracked several inches, alone in an empty parking lot at night, and these two things were standing inches away from the door. He did not wait to see what would happen next. He rolled up the window completely, his fingers fumbling with the controls. He started the engine, which seemed to take an eternity to turn over. He put the car in reverse and backed away from where the boys stood. They did not follow. They did not run after him. They simply stood there, watching, until his headlights swept away from them and he accelerated out of the parking lot. He did not look back. He did not stop until he was several miles from the shopping centre, pulling into a brightly lit gas station where other people were present. And even then, the dread did not fade. It stayed with him like a heavy weight on his chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. His hands were shaking. His shirt was damp with sweat. He sat in the gas station parking lot for 20 minutes before he felt calm enough to drive home. When he finally processed what had happened, when the immediate terror had subsided enough for him to think clearly, he wrote about it. He posted his account on an online forum called Ghost Village, a website dedicated to paranormal experiences and strange encounters. He expected skepticism or ridicule. He expected people to tell him he had imagined it, that it was a trick of the light, or a misunderstanding. Instead, he received messages from dozens of people who claimed they had experienced something remarkably similar. Chapter 3. The pattern emerges. Brian Bethel's account was not the first encounter with black-eyed children, but it was the first to gain widespread attention and documentation. Once his story circulated online through forums, message boards, and early paranormal websites, others began coming forward with their own experiences. Reports started appearing from across the United States, with concentrations in Texas, California, the Pacific Northwest, and the Midwest. Soon, accounts were being logged from Canada, particularly from Ontario and British Columbia. The United Kingdom reported encounters as well, with cases emerging from rural areas in Scotland, Wales, and northern England. The details varied in setting and circumstance, but certain elements remained strikingly consistent across hundreds of independent reports. The entities in question always appeared as children or young teenagers. Their ages seemed to range from around 8 years old to perhaps 16, though most witnesses described them as appearing to be between 10 and 13. They were usually seen in pairs, though some witnesses reported encountering them alone, or more rarely in groups of 3. Their clothing was described as plain and unremarkable, often slightly outdated, as if they were wearing hand-me-downs or second-hand items from a previous decade. Some wore hooded sweatshirts, others wore simple t-shirts and jeans. Nothing about their clothing was distinctive enough to remember clearly, which itself struck many witnesses as odd. Their behaviour followed a clear, almost ritualistic pattern. They approached homes, vehicles, or individuals in public spaces. They knocked on doors or windows, or they simply approached and stood waiting. When acknowledged, they made a request. They asked to be let in. The requests varied slightly depending on the situation. Some asked to use a phone, claiming they needed to call their parents or that they had gotten lost. Others claimed they needed to get warm, stating they had been walking for a long time and were cold. A few claimed they needed to use the bathroom or get a drink of water. Some simply stated that they wanted to come inside without offering any explanation whatsoever. But in every case, the request was framed as a question or a polite statement of need, not as a demand or threat. Witnesses reported the same overwhelming sense of dread that Bethel had described. Many said they felt physically ill during the encounter, experiencing symptoms that ranged from mild nausea to severe vertigo. Some experienced dizziness so intense they had to steady themselves against walls or furniture. Others described a sudden drop in perceived temperature, feeling as though the air around them had become cold despite the actual weather conditions. Many reported difficulty thinking clearly, as if their minds were clouded or their thoughts were being suppressed. The emotional response was nearly universal, cutting across different demographics, personality types, and levels of skepticism. People who described themselves as fearless reported being terrified. Individuals with no prior belief in the paranormal found themselves experiencing dread they could not rationalize away. Parents who would normally help any child in distress found themselves unable to open the door. The fear operated on a level that bypassed conscious thought and tapped directly into survival instinct. One woman from Portland, Oregon, reported that 2 children knocked on her door on a November evening in 1998. She lived in a suburban neighbourhood that was generally quiet and safe. She looked through the peephole of her front door and saw them standing motionless on her porch, positioned directly in front of the door, as if they knew exactly where to stand to be visible through the viewer. Something about their posture unnerved her immediately. They stood too still, without the fidgeting or shifting that children normally display when waiting. She did not open the door. Instead, she asked through the wood what they needed. They responded in monotone, voices that they were lost and needed to use her phone to call someone to pick them up. The request seemed reasonable, but something in their delivery felt wrong. She offered to call someone for them, suggesting they give her a number and she would make the call herself. They refused. They insisted they needed to come inside to make the call themselves. They said it was important. They said they needed to come in right away. She refused again, more firmly this time. There was a pause. Then they knocked again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, evenly spaced. She looked through the peephole and saw them still standing there, now staring directly at where the peephole was located, as if they could see her watching them. She backed away from the door. They knocked again, and again. Each sequence was 3 knocks, slow and rhythmic, with long pauses between. This continued for several minutes. She moved to a window that gave her a side view of the porch. She pulled the curtain aside slightly and looked out. They were still there, facing the door. She could not see their faces clearly from this angle, but she could see their general forms, small and still in the darkness. Then, without any apparent signal or communication between them, they both turned and walked away. Their movements were synchronized perfectly, as if choreographed. They walked down her driveway and onto the sidewalk, then simply vanished from her line of sight. When she checked her security camera footage the next morning, hoping to get a clear image of the children to perhaps identify them or report the incident, she found that the system had malfunctioned. The recording for the exact time frame of the encounter was missing. The system had been working properly before and after, with continuous footage showing her arriving home earlier and then later that night after the incident. But for those specific minutes when the children had been at her door, there was nothing, just a gap in the recording. Another account came from a man named Thomas Garrett, a long-haul truck driver from Manchester, England. In May of 2001, he was driving along a rural road in Yorkshire late at night, hauling freight from one distribution centre to another. The route was familiar to him, a 2-lane road that cut through farmland and small villages, the kind of road that saw very little traffic after dark. Around 2 in the morning, his headlights illuminated 2 figures standing on the side of the road ahead. As he approached, he could see they were children, both standing completely still, staring in his direction. This was unusual enough that he slowed down, concerned that they might be in trouble. He brought his truck to a stop on the shoulder, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. As the light fully illuminated the children, he got a clear look at them. 2 boys, one noticeably taller than the other, wearing simple dark clothing. They did not wave. They did not call out. They simply stood there watching the truck. He rolled down his window, leaning out slightly, and called to them. He asked if they were all right, if they needed help. The taller boy approached the truck slowly. He walked directly into the beam of the headlights without squinting or raising a hand to shield his eyes from the brightness. He came to the driver's side door and looked up at Garrett. In a flat voice, he asked if they could get in. He said they needed a ride. He did not say where to. He did not explain why they were alone on an empty road in the middle of the night. Garrett hesitated. Something about the way the child spoke felt wrong. The delivery was too even, too emotionless. He looked at the boy's face more carefully, trying to assess the situation, trying to determine if this was a genuine emergency or something else. That was when he saw the eyes, completely black. No variation, no reflection of the truck's lights, just solid darkness. The fear was immediate and visceral. Garrett did not say another word. He pulled his head back inside the truck, rolled up the window and released the brake. He accelerated hard, the truck lurching forward. In his side mirror he saw the 2 figures standing motionless, watching the truck drive away. They did not move. They did not follow. They simply stood there until they disappeared into the darkness behind him. He drove for another hour before stopping, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly the entire time. When he finally pulled into a rest stop and got out of the truck, his legs were shaking. He had been driving trucks for 15 years, had seen accidents and dealt with aggressive drivers and navigated dangerous weather, but nothing had ever made him feel the way he felt when he looked into those black eyes. These stories, and hundreds like them, began forming a recognizable phenomenon. The encounters shared too many similarities across different countries, cultures, and time periods to be easily dismissed as coincidence or mass hysteria. The black eyes, the polite but emotionless requests, the overwhelming fear, the need for permission. It was as if these entities were following a script, bound by rules they could not or would not break. Researchers began compiling databases of encounters, documenting patterns and looking for commonalities. Geography did not seem to matter. Urban, suburban and rural locations all reported encounters. Economic status did not correlate with likelihood of encounter. Education level, religious belief and skepticism about the paranormal showed no pattern either. The only consistent factors were the time of day, the behaviour of the entities, and the psychological response of the witnesses. Chapter 4. They never force. Entry. One of the most striking and puzzling aspects of the black-eyed children phenomenon is what they do not do. In almost every documented case spanning decades of reports, the entities never attempt to force their way inside. They do not try to break windows or kick down doors. They do not push past people when doors are opened. They do not become overtly violent or aggressive when refused. They simply wait, sometimes repeat their request with increasing insistence, and eventually leave. This detail has puzzled researchers, folklorists, and conspiracy theorists alike. If these beings are malevolent, as the overwhelming majority of witnesses believe based on the fear they inspire, why do they not simply take what they want? Why do they ask permission at all? What prevents them from using force? Some have suggested that the need for consent is a fundamental limitation, a rule imposed on them by the nature of their existence or by something beyond human understanding. This concept has deep roots in folklore and religious traditions across virtually every culture on Earth. In European vampire mythology, the most famous example is Count Dracula, who in Bram Stoker's novel must be invited into a home before he can enter. This limitation appears in vampire folklore across Eastern Europe, with variations in different regions but the core concept remaining consistent. The vampire, despite possessing supernatural strength and abilities, cannot cross the threshold of a home without the permission of someone inside. Once invited, however, the vampire can return at will, as the initial invitation breaks the protective barrier permanently. Similar restrictions appear in stories about demons and malevolent spirits. In Christian demonology, demons require some form of invitation or consent to possess a person or enter a sanctified space. The exorcism rituals of the Catholic Church are based on the principle that the demon entered through some act of permission, whether conscious or unconscious, and must be forcibly expelled through religious authority. The concept of demonic oppression versus possession hinges on this distinction. Oppression is external harassment, while possession requires internal access that was somehow permitted. Celtic and Irish folklore contains countless stories of the Fae, supernatural beings who follow strict rules about hospitality and threshold crossings. The Fae cannot enter a home without invitation, and humans are warned to be careful about what they offer to strange travellers, as accepting food or drink from the Fae or offering it to them can create obligations and bindings. The threshold of a home is considered a powerful boundary in these traditions, a liminal space between the mundane world and the supernatural realm. Jewish mysticism contains similar concepts, particularly regarding dibbuks, malicious spirits that seek to possess living hosts. The dibbuk requires some form of spiritual weakness, or opening to gain entry, often interpreted as permission granted through sinful behaviour or spiritual negligence. Protection prayers and rituals focus on maintaining spiritual boundaries that the dibbuk cannot cross without consent. Islamic tradition speaks of jinn, supernatural beings made of smokeless fire who can interact with the human world. While jinn have more freedom of movement than many supernatural entities in other traditions, they are still bound by certain rules regarding human dwellings, particularly those protected by prayer and religious observance. The threshold of a home blessed with proper prayers becomes a barrier that malevolent jinn find difficult to cross without some form of invitation or permission. The implication, when applied to the black-eyed children, is that these entities, whatever they are bound by the same fundamental principle. They require consent, they must be allowed entry, and if that consent is not given, they have no power to proceed. The question becomes, why would such a rule exist? What is the nature of a threshold that even supernatural beings must respect? One theory suggests that physical thresholds represent more than just architectural boundaries, they represent psychological and spiritual boundaries as well. A home is not just a structure, it is a space of safety, of personal sovereignty, of controlled environment. The threshold marks the boundary between the public world and the private world, between the space where you must interact with others according to social rules and the space where you make the rules. To cross a threshold without permission is to violate that sovereignty, and perhaps there is something in the fundamental structure of reality that prevents certain entities from doing so. This raises an unsettling question. Why would such a rule exist? If they are predators, why would they be restricted in this way? And if they are not predators, what do they want? One theory suggests that the act of consent itself is the key to their purpose. By inviting them in, the witness is making a choice, willingly opening a door that should have remained closed. Some researchers believe this act of permission has significance beyond the physical realm, that it represents a kind of spiritual or metaphysical contract with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate encounter. In this interpretation, the black-eyed children do not simply want to enter a physical space. They want the act of invitation itself, the moment when a person chooses to override their instincts and let them in. The invitation might be the goal, not the entry. Others argue that the need for permission is psychological rather than metaphysical. These entities, according to this theory, feed on fear and psychological distress. By forcing their victims to make a conscious choice, by creating a situation where the witness must actively decide whether to help or refuse, they maximize the psychological impact of the encounter. The witness is left not only with the memory of what they saw, but with the knowledge that they chose to engage, that they were complicit in the interaction. Those who refuse are left with guilt, wondering if they denied help to children who genuinely needed it. Those who accept face consequences that are rarely reported and poorly understood. A third perspective focuses on the concept of free will. Many religious and philosophical traditions hold free will as sacred, a fundamental aspect of human existence that even supernatural forces cannot violate directly. If the black-eyed children are bound by this principle, they can influence, frighten, and request, but they cannot force. The choice must be made freely, even if the psychological pressure they exert makes that choice feel anything but free. Whatever the explanation, the pattern holds across hundreds of documented encounters. They ask, they wait. They may repeat the request with increasing insistence. They may make the witness feel tremendous pressure to comply, but they do not force, and if the answer is no, they eventually leave. But the fear does not leave. The memory does not fade, and the question remains. What would have happened if the answer had been yes? Chapter 5. Physical and psychological effects. The aftermath of an encounter with the black-eyed children is often as disturbing as the encounter itself. Witnesses report a wide range of physical and psychological symptoms that persist long after the entities have gone, sometimes for days, sometimes for months, and in rare cases, apparently indefinitely. The immediate physical symptoms are remarkably consistent. During the encounter, witnesses report rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, nausea, dizziness, and cold sweats. These are typical fear responses, but their intensity is often described as disproportionate to the situation. Many witnesses state that they have experienced fear before, some have even been in life-threatening situations, but the fear during a black-eyed children encounter operates on a different level entirely. It is described as primal, instinctive, bypassing rational thought, and triggering every survival mechanism the body possesses. After the encounter, many witnesses describe lingering anxiety that persists even after they have reached safety. This is not typical anxiety about a disturbing experience. It is a constant feeling of being watched or followed, a sense that something is wrong even when everything appears normal. Some witnesses report looking over their shoulders constantly for days or weeks. Others report difficulty being alone, particularly at night, feeling vulnerable in ways they never had before. Sleep disturbances are among the most commonly reported after effects. Witnesses describe difficulty falling asleep, with the image of the black eyes appearing whenever they close their own. Those who do manage to sleep often experience nightmares. The content of these nightmares varies, but certain themes appear repeatedly across different reports. Many nightmares feature the children standing at a distance watching. The witness is aware of their presence but cannot see them clearly. They are always at the edge of vision, just beyond clear sight, but their presence is undeniable. The witness feels unable to move, paralysed by fear, knowing that the children are getting closer even though they never seem to move. The nightmares often end with the children standing directly beside the witness, leaning in close, their black eyes filling the entire field of vision. Other nightmares involve the witness making different choices during the encounter. In these dreams, they open the door or unlock the car, the children enter, and then the dream becomes confused and fragmented, filled with a sense of overwhelming wrongness but no clear images or events. The witness wakes with the feeling that something terrible happened but no memory of what it was. These nightmares leave witnesses feeling exhausted and disturbed, sometimes more so than nightmares with clear, frightening content. A woman from Colorado reported experiencing the same nightmare for 3 weeks following her encounter. In the dream, she opened her front door to find the children standing on her porch. They asked to come in. She heard herself say yes, even though she was screaming no in her mind. They walked past her into her house, and she followed them. They went to her bedroom, opened her closet, and stood inside it facing the back wall. She tried to close the closet door, but it would not close. She tried to push them out, but her hands passed through them as if they were not solid. Then she woke up. Every night the same dream, with only minor variations. After 3 weeks, the dream stopped as suddenly as they had started, but she reported that for months afterward, she could not look at her closet without feeling a spike of anxiety. The nightmares often share a quality that witnesses describe as more vivid than normal dreams. Colours seem brighter, sounds seem clearer, the experiences feel more real than actual memories. Some researchers have suggested this might indicate something beyond typical dream activity, possibly memories of additional encounters that the witness does not consciously recall, or perhaps some form of psychological implantation by the entities themselves. Physical symptoms beyond the immediate fear response have also been reported. Headaches are common, often described as pressure headaches that concentrate behind the eyes. These can last for days after an encounter and are sometimes accompanied by sensitivity to light. Some witnesses report feeling physically exhausted for days following an encounter, experiencing fatigue that does not improve with rest. Others describe vague feelings of illness, a sense of being unwell without specific symptoms that would warrant medical attention. One particularly common and disturbing category of after effects involves electronic disturbances. Security cameras fail to record during encounters, a phenomenon reported so consistently that it has become one of the defining characteristics of black-eyed children cases. Phones freeze or shut off during or immediately after encounters. Some witnesses report their phones displaying strange behaviour for days afterward, calling random numbers, activating without being touched, or displaying corrupted images and video. Car electronics have been reported to malfunction during encounters, with dashboard lights flickering, radios turning on and off, or engines sputtering. Some witnesses have reported complete electrical failure while the children were near their vehicles, with the car refusing to start until the children left. Streetlights are frequently reported to flicker or go out entirely when the children are present, a phenomenon that sometimes affects entire blocks. A man from Wisconsin reported that after his encounter, every electronic device in his home behaved strangely for a week. His television would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, always displaying static or a blank blue screen. His microwave would randomly start running empty. His computer would freeze and display strings of random characters across the screen. His clock radios would reset to midnight repeatedly. He called an electrician, who found no problems with the wiring or electrical system. After a week, everything returned to normal without explanation. Some witnesses claim that these electronic disturbances continue sporadically for months or even years, as if the presence of the children left some kind of residual effect that lingers in the environment or attached to the witness themselves. Skeptics point out that electronic malfunctions are common, and that the witnesses might be experiencing normal technical problems, but attributing them to the encounter due to heightened attention and anxiety. Believers counter that the concentration of malfunctions immediately following encounters is too consistent to be coincidental. A particularly unsettling subset of reports involves witnesses who claim the children returned, not immediately but weeks. Months later, always at night, always unexpected, always asking the same question. These repeat encounters are relatively rare in the documented cases, but they follow the same pattern. The children knock or appear, they wait, they ask to come in, and when refused, they leave. But witnesses of repeat encounters report that the fear is amplified with each occurrence, as if the familiarity does not reduce the terror, but intensifies it. One woman from Northern California reported 3 separate encounters over a 6-month period. The first time, 2 children knocked on her door around midnight. She did not answer. The second time, 3 months later, they appeared at her bedroom window on the 2nd floor of her house, somehow standing at a height that should have been impossible without a ladder. She closed the curtains and called the police, but by the time officers arrived, the children were gone and there were no signs that anyone had been there. The third time, 2 months after, they knocked on her car window while she was parked outside a grocery store in broad daylight. This was unusual, as encounters almost universally occur at night or in darkness. She drove away immediately. She moved to a different city 2 weeks later and has not reported any further encounters, but she states that she still checks her locks multiple times every night and cannot shake the feeling that they know where she is. These repeat encounters raise troubling questions. Do the children target specific individuals? Do they remember who refused them? Is there something about certain people that attracts their attention? The pattern suggests intent and memory, implying that these entities possess intelligence and purpose beyond simple mechanical behaviour. Some researchers have suggested that these psychological effects are the result of trauma, that the sheer intensity of the fear experienced during the encounter leaves a lasting imprint on the brain similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the intrusive thoughts, and the anxiety are all consistent with trauma responses. Treatment approaches that work for PTSD, including therapy and medication, have been reported to help some witnesses manage their symptoms. Others believe the symptoms are evidence of something more sinister, that the children leave behind a kind of psychic residue, a lingering presence that continues to affect the witness long after the physical encounter has ended. Some occult researchers have suggested that the encounter creates a connection between the witness and the entities, a link that allows the children to maintain some form of influence or awareness of the witness even at a distance. This theory is supported by the reports of repeat encounters and the feeling many witnesses describe of being watched even when alone. There is also a small number of reports from witnesses who claim that their symptoms eventually faded completely, sometimes spontaneously and sometimes following specific actions they took. These actions vary widely and include religious rituals, protective charms, moving to a new location, or simply the passage of time. No consistent method of relief has been identified, and what works for one witness may have no effect for another. The long-term psychological impact on witnesses is difficult to quantify. Many are reluctant to discuss their experiences outside of anonymous online forums, fearing ridicule or disbelief. Some report that the encounter fundamentally changed their worldview, forcing them to accept the existence of phenomena they previously dismissed. Others report that it created ongoing fear and anxiety that affected their quality of life, their relationships, and their sense of safety in the world. But they remember. Every one of them remembers the eyes, and that memory does not fade. Chapter 6. What could they be? The question of what the black-eyed children actually are has generated a wide range of theories, each attempting to explain the phenomenon through a different lens. Some theories are grounded in the supernatural, others in science fiction, and a few in psychology and sociology. None have been proven, and none have been definitively ruled out. The lack of physical evidence makes verification impossible, leaving us with only the testimony of witnesses and the patterns that emerge from hundreds of similar accounts. The extraterrestrial hypothesis. One of the most popular theories is that the children are extraterrestrial in nature, either aliens themselves or hybrids, created through genetic manipulation, involving both human and alien DNA. Proponents of this idea point to similarities between black-eyed children encounters and other UFO-related phenomena. The emotionless demeanour matches descriptions from alleged alien abduction cases. Abductees frequently describe their captors as showing no recognisable emotion, communicating in flat, monotone voices or through telepathy, and appearing to follow programmed behaviours rather than acting with spontaneous creativity. The black eyes, while different from the large black eyes typically described in grey alien encounters, still suggest non-human origin. The unsettling feeling that witnesses describe, that sense of wrongness that operates below conscious thought, is remarkably similar to what abductees report feeling in the presence of alien beings. It has been described as the uncanny valley effect multiplied exponentially, the feeling that something is wearing a human disguise but doing so imperfectly. Some theorists suggest that the black-eyed children are hybrids, beings created by combining human and alien genetics to produce entities that can pass as human but retain alien characteristics and abilities. The need for permission, in this context, could be interpreted as a test or experiment. Perhaps the aliens are studying human behaviour, observing how people react when confronted with the unknown. Perhaps they are testing boundaries, learning about human intuition and decision-making processes. The electronic disturbances reported during encounters support the extraterrestrial theory. UFO sightings are frequently accompanied by electromagnetic effects, including interference with electronic devices, car engines dying, and lights flickering or failing. If the black-eyed children are extraterrestrial or associated with extraterrestrial technology, the electronic failures would be explained by the same mechanisms that cause similar effects during UFO encounters. Critics of this theory point out that extraterrestrial beings capable of travelling to Earth would presumably have no need to knock on doors and ask for permission. If they possess the technology for interstellar travel, they could presumably abduct or observe humans without requiring cooperation. Supporters counter that the requirement might not be technological but ethical, that advanced civilizations might operate under strict non-interference principles that prohibit forcing contact, allowing only interactions where humans choose to engage. The interdimensional hypothesis. Another theory suggests that the children are interdimensional beings, entities that exist in a reality adjacent to our own, and occasionally cross over into our world. This theory has gained traction among researchers who find the extraterrestrial hypothesis insufficient to explain certain aspects of the phenomenon. According to this view, multiple dimensions or parallel realities exist alongside our own, normally separated but occasionally intersecting. The black-eyed children exist in one of these adjacent dimensions and can perceive or access our reality under certain conditions. The act of asking permission could be a requirement for crossing the threshold between dimensions, a rule imposed by the nature of reality itself rather than by any external force. This theory explains several puzzling aspects of the encounters. The sudden appearances and disappearances with no one seeing the children arrive or leave would make sense if they are literally stepping between dimensions. The lack of physical evidence, including the absence of fingerprints, footprints, or any biological traces, would be explained by their origin in a different reality. Their solid appearance during encounters but complete absence otherwise suggests they exist primarily elsewhere and only temporarily manifest in our dimension. The electronic disturbances would be explained as side effects of dimensional interaction. The boundary between dimensions might create electromagnetic interference, disrupting electronic devices in the vicinity. This would also explain why the disturbances are temporary, fading once the children depart and the dimensional boundary closes. The need for permission in this context takes on interesting implications. If crossing between dimensions requires an act of will from both sides, if the boundary can only be crossed when someone from each dimension agrees to the crossing, then the children would need explicit consent from a human to fully enter our reality. The request to come inside might be literal, asking not just for entry into a physical space but for permission to cross dimensional boundaries and exist fully in our world. Some versions of this theory propose that the children are not malevolent but trapped, seeking a way to permanently cross into our dimension for reasons we do not understand. Perhaps they are refugees from a dying dimension, or explorers who became stranded. Their frightening appearance and the dread they inspire might be unavoidable side effects of their dimensional nature rather than intentional intimidation. The demonic hypothesis. A third explanation draws from religious and occult traditions, suggesting that the black-eyed children are demonic entities, malevolent spiritual beings that seek to harm or corrupt human souls. This theory is popular among religious believers and those familiar with exorcism traditions and demonology. In Christian demonology, demons are fallen angels, spiritual beings that rebelled against God and were cast out of heaven. They retain supernatural abilities but are bound by certain restrictions and limitations. One of these limitations is the inability to directly violate human free will. Demons can tempt, deceive, and frighten, but they cannot force compliance. This aligns perfectly with the behaviour of the black-eyed children, who can ask and insist but never force entry. The act of inviting them in, whether into a home or a vehicle, could represent a form of spiritual consent, opening the door to possession or demonic influence. Once invited, the demon gains authority that it did not have before, authority that was granted voluntarily even if under pressure or deception. This would explain why the children are so insistent, why they may return repeatedly to the same location or person. They are seeking that moment of consent, that act of invitation that grants them access. The black eyes, in this interpretation, are a sign of their true nature, a glimpse of the darkness that lies beneath the human disguise. In biblical and religious art, darkness and the absence of light are consistently associated with evil and separation from divine presence. The completely black eyes, devoid of any light or life, would represent pure spiritual darkness, the utter absence of divine grace. The fear response would be explained as spiritual discernment, the human soul recognizing the presence of evil even when the conscious mind cannot articulate why. Many religious traditions teach that humans have an innate ability to sense the presence of spiritual beings, that the soul can perceive what the physical senses cannot. The overwhelming dread that witnesses experience would be this spiritual perception warning them of danger. Exorcists and demonologists note that the behaviour of the black-eyed children matches patterns described in historical accounts of demonic harassment. The knocking at doors and windows, the request to be admitted, the persistence despite refusal, the generation of fear and anxiety, all align with documented cases of demonic activity. Some exorcists have reported dealing with individuals who claim to have let the children in, though these cases are poorly documented and difficult to verify. Protection methods suggested by this theory include prayer, religious symbols, blessed objects, and spiritual authority exercised through faith. Some witnesses who adopted these practices report feeling safer and experiencing fewer symptoms, though this could be psychological rather than spiritual in effect. The theory struggles to explain why encounters occur to people of all faiths and no faith, with no apparent pattern based on religious belief or practice. The psychological hypothesis. A more sceptical perspective argues that the black-eyed children are not real external entities at all, but rather a modern urban legend fueled by the internet, social contagion, and psychological factors including suggestion, sleep deprivation, and pattern recognition. According to this theory, the phenomenon began with Brian Bethel's account in 1996 and spread through online forums, message boards, and social media. The story resonated with deep-seated human fears, particularly fears about trusting appearances, about danger disguised as innocence, and about the corruption of childhood. As the story spread, people began reinterpreting their own experiences through this lens, attributing encounters with odd-acting children or disturbing dreams to the black-eyed children phenomenon. Subsequent reports are explained as a combination of hoaxes, misidentifications, and genuine psychological experiences interpreted through the filter of the urban legend. Hoaxers fabricate encounters for attention or entertainment. People have normal encounters with unusual-looking children, perhaps kids with medical conditions or wearing theatrical contact lenses, and interpret the experience as supernatural because they have been primed by exposure to black-eyed children stories. Some witnesses might be experiencing sleep paralysis, a condition that causes waking hallucinations often featuring dark figures, which they interpret as black-eyed children based on cultural conditioning. The consistency of the reports, rather than proving the existence of the children, simply reflects the way stories evolve and standardize in the digital age. As more people share their accounts online, later witnesses unconsciously incorporate elements from earlier stories, creating a self-reinforcing pattern. This is not necessarily intentional deception. Human memory is highly malleable, and exposure to similar stories can reshape how we remember our own experiences. The fear response is explained through psychology rather than supernatural influence. The image of children with completely black eyes triggers the uncanny valley effect, the psychological discomfort humans feel when encountering something that is almost but not quite human. This response is believed to be an evolved defense mechanism, helping our ancestors identify and avoid the sick, the dead, or the dangerous. Modern humans retain this sensitivity, and the black eyes create a powerful trigger that generates intense fear. The need for permission is explained as a detail that emerged organically in the early stories and became standardized through repetition. It adds dramatic tension and taps into deep cultural narratives about thresholds, hospitality, and the power of consent. Stories are more compelling when the protagonist has agency, when they must make a choice, so this element naturally propagated through the evolving urban legend. Electronic failures are explained as either fabrications added to embellish the story, normal technical malfunctions that occur regularly but are noticed and remembered only in the context of a disturbing experience, or in some cases, deliberate hoaxing using devices to interfere with electronics. This theory is supported by the fact that despite thousands of reported encounters, there is no physical evidence, no photographs, no video footage, no biological traces. No witnesses have ever managed to capture clear documentation of the children. In an age where nearly everyone carries a camera-equipped phone, the complete absence of photographic evidence is striking. Critics of the psychological hypothesis point out that it requires dismissing the testimony of hundreds of witnesses from different countries and cultures, many of whom had no prior knowledge of the phenomenon and report strikingly consistent details. It also fails to explain why some witnesses would experience such intense fear over what amounts to children with unusual eyes asking for help, particularly when some witnesses are parents or professionals trained to remain calm in crisis situations. The Tulpa hypothesis. A more esoteric theory suggests that the black-eyed children are thought forms or tulpas, entities created by collective human consciousness. This concept originates in Tibetan Buddhism, but has been adopted and modified in Western occultism and paranormal research. According to Tulpa theory, concentrated thought and belief can give form to abstract ideas, creating entities that exist independently of any single mind. The black-eyed children, in this view, began as a story but accumulated enough belief and emotional energy to manifest as actual entities. They exist because people believe in them, and each encounter reinforces their existence, feeding them with fear and attention. This theory explains why the phenomenon seems to have emerged relatively recently and spread through online communication. The internet allowed the rapid dissemination of the story and the concentration of belief and fear. As more people learned about the black-eyed children, thought about them, feared them, the tulpa grew stronger and more able to manifest. The need for permission might represent a limitation of thought form existence. A tulpa requires interaction with human consciousness to maintain its form. By engaging with humans, by making them react and remember and fear, the tulpa reinforces its own existence. The request to enter might be a way of deepening that engagement, of creating a stronger connection between the entity and the human consciousness that sustains it. This theory is difficult to prove or disprove and exists at the intersection of psychology and metaphysics. It allows for both the reality of the encounters and the lack of physical evidence, suggesting that the children exist in a space between the purely physical and the purely imaginary. The government experiment hypothesis. A conspiracy-oriented theory proposes that the black-eyed children are the result of classified government experiments, possibly involving genetic modification, mind control, or advanced psychological operations. According to this theory, government agencies conducted secret programs to create individuals with unusual abilities or characteristics. These experiments might have involved manipulation of human genetics, exposure to unknown technologies, or the use of experimental drugs and procedures. The black-eyed children are either test subjects from these programs or their descendants, individuals with modified genetics that affect their appearance and perhaps grant them unusual abilities. The black eyes might be a side effect of genetic modification or exposure to experimental treatments. The emotional flatness and strange behaviour could result from psychological conditioning or neurological alterations. Their ability to generate fear might be a designed feature, a weapon that allows them to control situations without physical violence. The pattern of their behaviour, asking permission, rather than forcing entry, could be programming or training rather than supernatural limitation. Perhaps they were taught to follow these rules as part of their conditioning, or perhaps the rules represent protocols they must follow to avoid detection and interference. The lack of official investigation and the silence of authorities is explained not as inability to investigate but as active suppression. If the black-eyed children are the products of classified programs, government agencies would have reason to prevent public awareness and official scrutiny. Witnesses who report encounters to police find their reports dismissed or ignored because orders have been given to suppress information about the phenomenon. This theory struggles to explain why these individuals would be sent to knock on random doors asking for entry, what purpose this would serve, or why the program would still be operating decades after it presumably began. It also fails to explain reports from countries unlikely to be involved in coordinated government experimentation. The collective unconscious manifestation. A theory rooted in Jungian psychology suggests that the black-eyed children are manifestations of archetypes from the collective unconscious, universal symbols and fears shared by all humans regardless of cultural background. The shadow child archetype represents innocence corrupted, potential unfulfilled, or the dark aspects of humanity's future. The black eyes symbolize the loss of soul or spirit, beings that have the form of humanity but lack the essential quality that makes us human. By appearing as children but generating primal fear, they embody the corruption of innocence, one of humanity's deepest anxieties. According to this theory, these archetypal figures occasionally breach the boundary between the unconscious and the physical world, manifesting in forms that can be perceived and experienced. They are neither purely psychological nor purely physical, but exist in a space where mind and matter intersect. This theory explains the cultural universality of the phenomenon and the deep psychological impact it has on witnesses. It also explains why the encounters feel more significant than their surface details would suggest, why witnesses often describe them as life-changing experiences. They are not simply seeing strange-looking children, but encountering a manifestation of deep psychological symbolism. Each of these theories has its advocates and its critics. Each explains some aspects of the phenomenon while struggling with others. The truth, if there is a singular truth, remains elusive. What can be said with certainty is that hundreds of people across multiple countries and decades have reported remarkably consistent encounters with entities that appear as children with completely black eyes, who ask for permission to enter homes or vehicles, and who generate overwhelming fear in those who see them. Whatever they are, they follow rules, and understanding those rules might be the key to understanding the phenomenon itself. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. If you enjoy what you're about to hear, please consider using those hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know, and it keeps stories like this one coming. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to know this community spans the entire globe. And a massive thank you to Amber for suggesting tonight's story. This one's a deep dive, and it all started with your recommendation. Now, let's begin. The Northwoods Files. The plan. They never burned. Imagine finding a document that was never supposed to exist. A carbon copy of something so disturbing, so carefully orchestrated, that even after it was supposedly declassified, 6 pages remained hidden. 6 pages that suggest the most controversial false flag operation in American history didn't die when the president rejected it. 6 pages that imply it simply went underground, evolved, and became the foundation for something far more sinister. This is the story of Operation Northwoods, but not the version you might have heard about. This is about what happened after the plan was rejected. This is about the pages that vanished. This is about a researcher who found them and then disappeared himself. This is about the possibility that Northwoods never really ended at all. The page that should have been shredded May 1998. College Park, Maryland, the National Archives. 2 buildings sits like a fortress of secrets. Its climate-controlled vaults holding millions of documents that chronicle the hidden machinery of American power. Most researchers who walk through its doors are academics, historians, graduate students chasing footnotes for dissertations that 3 people will ever read. Daniel Reeves was different. He had been coming to the archives for 6 months, systematically working through declassified intelligence files from the Cold War. He had a theory, one that most of his colleagues dismissed as paranoid speculation. Daniel believed that the government's covert operations against Cuba in the early 60s had left a paper trail that told a very different story than the official narrative. He believed that some operations approved at the highest levels had been deliberately obscured, their true scope hidden even in declassified materials. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. They were wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a kind of grey spring day where rain threatens but never quite arrives. Daniel sat at his usual desk in the research room, surrounded by file boxes containing Pentagon budget documents from 1962. Tedious material, page after page of appropriations, personnel transfers, equipment requisitions. The kind of bureaucratic minutiae that makes most people's eyes glaze over. Daniel loved it. Because sometimes, in the margins of budget reports and personnel files, you found things that were never meant to be found. He was halfway through a box labelled Pentagon-1962 Budget Amendments when he noticed something odd. The folder tabs were colour-coded by month, a standard archival practice. But one folder near the back had the wrong colour tab. It was filed as if it belonged to March, but the tab was blue instead of green. Daniel pulled it out. The label read, Contingency Planning - Cuba Operations - March through August 62. That wasn't a budget document. His pulse quickened as he opened the folder. Inside were approximately 40 pages, some typed on official Department of Defense letterhead, others appearing to be carbon copies made on that distinctive onion skin paper that government offices used back then. The pages smelled like old basements and secrets. The first page was familiar. He recognised it immediately because he had seen it before, in a different context, years earlier. It was the cover memo of Operation Northwoods. Most people with even a passing interest in conspiracy theories know about Operation Northwoods. It was declassified in 1997 by the Assassination Records Review Board as part of the JFK Files release. The basic facts are not in dispute. In March of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a proposal for false flag terrorist operations to be conducted against American civilians and military targets, then blamed on Cuba to justify a military invasion. The proposal was insane. It suggested hijacking planes, bombing American cities, staging funerals for fake victims, even sinking American ships and blaming Castro. It was signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs. It was delivered to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962, and President Kennedy rejected it almost immediately. That's where the official story ends. The plan was too extreme, too immoral, too risky. Kennedy said no, and Northwoods was filed away as a historical curiosity, proof that even in the fevered atmosphere of the Cold War, there were lines the government would not cross. Daniel had read the declassified Northwoods memo multiple times. It was 15 pages long, single-spaced, dense with bureaucratic language that barely concealed its horrifying implications. But the document in his hands was not 15 pages long. It was 21 pages. He felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest as he flipped through the pages. The first 15 were identical to the declassified version. He recognized specific paragraphs, particular turns of phrase, but then came page 16, and the document continued into territory he had never seen before. Page 16 was titled Addendum-Contingency Patterns Alpha through Gamma. Daniel's hands were shaking now. He pulled out his phone to take photographs, then remembered that cameras were not permitted in this section of the archives. He would have to read it here, memorize what he could, and request official copies through the proper channels. He began reading. Contingency Pattern Alpha was outlined first. It elaborated on the hijacking scenarios mentioned in the main memo, but with far more detail. Specific airlines were named. Particular routes were suggested. There were contingencies for media coverage, instructions for coordinating with cleared journalists to ensure the story was reported in specific ways. Cleared journalists. Daniel underlined the phrase in his mind. Pattern Beta expanded on the fake funeral concept, but again with disturbing specificity. It discussed the psychological impact of televised grief, the importance of victim narratives in shaping public opinion, the ways that emotional trauma could be channeled into political support for military action. Then came Pattern Gamma. The heading read, Psychological Continuity Operation Gamma Framework. The language shifted here. It became more abstract, more theoretical. It referenced academic research on mass psychology, studies on propaganda effectiveness, analyses of how populations respond to fear. There were citations to RAND Corporation reports, references to research conducted at major universities. And then, halfway down page 18, Daniel found the sentence that made his stomach drop. Gamma Activation Protocol. Implement only upon presidential refusal of primary operations. Gamma represents long-term strategic alternative to direct action, focusing on gradual conditioning rather than immediate provocation. Daniel read it again. Then a third time. Gamma was not an alternative to Northwoods. It was what happened if Northwoods was rejected. It was Plan B. The next 2 pages outlined Gamma in more detail. It described a multi-year program of perception management and narrative conditioning. It suggested using media assets to gradually shift public opinion, creating a climate where military intervention in Cuba would eventually become politically inevitable, even without a specific triggering incident. It talked about cooperative elements in news organizations, entertainment media, and academia. It referenced ongoing programs already in place, suggesting that some form of this operation was already active even as the Northwoods memo was being drafted. And then, on page 20, Daniel found the signatures. Every member of the Joint Chiefs had signed, just as they had on the main Northwoods memo. But on this version, there was an additional line below their signatures. It read, Presidential Authorization. Blank date. March 1662. Someone had drawn a line through this blank space and written a single word in pen, declined. But the handwriting looked wrong. Daniel had seen Kennedy's signature dozens of times in various documents. The slant was different. The pressure of the pen was too heavy. The letter forms did not quite match. He flipped to the final page, page 21. It was a memo dated March 23rd, 1962, 9 days after the Northwoods memo was delivered to McNamara. It was from the office of General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. and it was addressed to a list of approximately 15 recipients whose names had been blacked out with marker. The text was brief. Presidential rejection of primary operations confirmed. Proceed with implementation of Gamma framework as outlined in addendum. Maintain operational security at highest level. All coordinating materials to be removed from official channels and transferred to designated secure storage. Anticipate minimum 5-year timeline for full effectiveness. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If this document was authentic, it meant that after Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods, the Joint Chiefs did not simply abandon the plan. They activated a backup operation designed to achieve the same goal through psychological manipulation instead of direct action. And they did it without presidential approval. He checked his watch. The archives closed in an hour. He needed to make copies of this file, but the standard procedure required submitting a formal request that could take weeks to process. By then, if someone realized this document was not supposed to be accessible, it might disappear. He stood up and walked to the reference desk, carrying the folder. A supervisor he had worked with before, a woman named Patricia Ellison, was reviewing some paperwork behind the counter. "Patricia, I need to request copies of this entire folder. It's from the Cuba Operations Collection, March 62. Patricia took the folder and glanced at the label. Her expression changed immediately. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes, but Daniel caught it. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "It was in Box 17 of the Pentagon Budget Series. It was misfiled, I think." Patricia opened the folder and flipped through the pages. Her face went carefully neutral. "I need to verify something. Can you wait here for a moment?" She disappeared into the back offices, taking the folder with her. Daniel waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He felt a growing unease that he could not quite explain. When Patricia returned, she did not have the folder. Her expression was professional, but cold. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves. That folder contains materials that are still under review. It was not supposed to be in the open collection. I cannot process a copy request at this time." But it was in the declassified section. The box was clearly marked as available for research. Nevertheless, the folder itself contains restricted materials. I've notified the appropriate department. The issue will be corrected. Can you at least tell me what the restriction is based on? The main Northwoods memo was fully declassified in 97. Patricia's expression did not change. I cannot comment on the classification status of materials I have not been authorized to discuss. Is there anything else I can help you with today? The message was clear. This conversation was over. Daniel left the archives that afternoon feeling like he had touched something he was never meant to see. He spent the evening writing down everything he could remember from those 6 additional pages, filling a dozen notebook pages with details while they were still fresh in his mind. The next morning he returned to the archives. He went straight to Box 17 of the Pentagon Budget Series and searched for the blue-tabbed folder. It was gone. Patricia was not at the reference desk. He asked another employee about her and was told she had the day off. He requested Box 17 again and went through it page by page. The budget documents were still there, but the folder on Cuba operations had vanished completely. It was as if it had never existed at all. But Daniel Reeves knew what he had seen, and he knew that someone had not wanted him to see it. So he began to dig deeper. The real history. To understand what Daniel had stumbled onto, you need to understand the actual history of Operation Northwoods. And the thing about Northwoods is that the basic facts are not disputed. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented, verified, historical reality. Let's start at the beginning. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces took control of Cuba, overthrowing the Batista regime that had been friendly to American interests. Within months, the relationship between the United States and Cuba deteriorated rapidly. Castro nationalized American-owned properties, aligned himself with the Soviet Union, and transformed Cuba into a communist state just 90 miles from Florida. The American government, particularly the CIA and the Pentagon, became obsessed with removing Castro. The obsession was not just ideological. Cuba's proximity to the United States, combined with its alliance with the Soviets, represented a genuine strategic threat in the context of the Cold War. The first major attempt to remove Castro came in April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. A CIA-trained force of Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast, intending to spark a popular uprising against Castro. The operation was an absolute disaster. The invasion force was defeated within 3 days. More than 100 invaders were killed, and over 1,000 were captured. The failure humiliated the CIA, embarrassed President Kennedy, and strengthened Castro's position. But rather than deterring further action, the Bay of Pigs failure made certain elements within the American military and intelligence establishment more determined than ever to bring Castro down. This is where Operation Northwoods enters the picture. In February 1962, General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, authorized the creation of a proposal for covert operations designed to justify American military intervention in Cuba. The task was given to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, particularly Brigadier General William Craig, who headed up the Cuba project within the Pentagon. The result was a document officially titled Justification for United States Military Intervention in Cuba, but which became known as Operation Northwoods. The memo was delivered to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara on March 13, 1962. It was signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff: General Lemnitzer, General George Decker of the Army, Admiral George Anderson of the Navy, General Curtis LeMay of the Air Force, and General David Shoup of the Marine Corps. The proposals contained in that memo remain shocking even today, more than 60 years later. The Joint Chiefs suggested staging terrorist attacks against American civilians and military targets, then blaming those attacks on Cuba to create public support for an invasion. The specific proposals included starting rumours about Cuban sabotage using clandestine radio broadcasts, landing friendly Cubans in uniform inside Cuba, then claiming they were victims of Cuban aggression, creating incidents at Guantanamo Bay, including staging attacks on the base and creating fake casualties, developing a terror campaign in Miami and other Florida cities, with bombings and acts of violence blamed on Cuban agents, sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees en route to Florida, real or simulated, staging a fake attack on a civilian aircraft with passengers using aliases to create the appearance that Cuba had shot down an American plane, creating a fake incident where a commercial airliner appeared to be attacked by Cuban forces while flying near Cuba, using a duplicate aircraft to create the illusion. These were not vague suggestions. The memo included detailed planning, specific scenarios, and recommendations for how to manage the media coverage to ensure maximum public impact. The language of the document is clinical, bureaucratic, almost casual in its discussion of false flag terrorism. One passage reads, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. Real or simulated." As if the difference were merely a technical detail. Another section suggests, "It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States. The destination would be chosen only to heighten the credibility of the operation and create the impression of rash Cuban rashness. When you read the actual document, what strikes you is not just the immorality of the proposals, but the matter-of-fact tone. These were serious military leaders discussing terrorist attacks on their own citizens, the way someone might discuss logistical planning for a supply convoy. President Kennedy's response to the Northwoods proposal was swift and definitive. He rejected it. There is no record of any serious consideration given to implementing the plan. Kennedy had already been burned by the Bay of Pigs debacle, and he was deeply skeptical of the aggressive military solutions being pushed by the Pentagon and the CIA. In August of 1962, just 5 months after the Northwoods memo was delivered, General Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was reassigned to be the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a prestigious position, but one that effectively removed him from direct influence over Cuba policy. The official story says that this was the end of Operation Northwoods. Kennedy said no, Lemnitzer was sidelined, and the plan was filed away as a historical artifact. Except Daniel Reeves had found evidence that suggested a very different story. The part no one acknowledges. Daniel spent the next 3 weeks systematically searching for any other references to Contingency Gamma, or the extended version of the Northwoods memo. He worked his way through related collections at the archives, requested files from the JFK Presidential Library, and contacted researchers who specialized in Cold War covert operations. He found nothing. Or rather, he found absences where something should have been. Several files related to Cuba operations from March through August 1962 were listed in the archive's catalogue but marked as unavailable for research purposes. When Daniel requested information about why they were restricted, he received vague responses about ongoing classification review or materials not yet processed. This was unusual. The Assassination Records Review Board had conducted a massive declassification effort in the mid-90s, specifically focused on materials related to Cuba, the CIA, and Kennedy's assassination. Most relevant files from that era had been declassified and made available. The fact that certain files were still restricted decades later suggested someone had a specific reason for keeping them sealed. Daniel also discovered something odd about the declassification of the main Northwoods memo itself. While it had been released in 1997 as part of the JFK files, the memo's existence had actually been revealed much earlier. In a 1994 book by James Bamford about the National Security Agency, Northwoods was briefly mentioned as an example of rejected covert operation proposals. But Bamford's description of the memo included details that did not appear in the later declassified version. He mentioned multi-phase implementation strategies and psychological operations, components that were supposedly part of the Northwoods proposal. When the actual memo was declassified 3 years later, those elements were not present. Daniel tracked down Bamford's contact information and sent him an email explaining what he had found. Bamford responded within a day, and they arranged a phone call. "I remember those details," Bamford said when Daniel asked about the discrepancies. "I saw a summary of Northwoods in a different document, something from the NSA's files about Cuba operations. It mentioned that Northwoods had multiple components, including some kind of media coordination plan and a long-term psychological operation." "Did you ever see the full document?" Daniel asked. "No, just summaries and references in other materials. I assumed everything was in the main memo when it was declassified. But if you're saying there were additional pages..." Bamford trailed off. "That would explain some things." "Like what?" "Like why McNamara was always so evasive when asked about Northwoods. He gave testimony about it in the 90s, but he refused to discuss certain aspects. He kept saying some elements were not appropriate for public discussion, or were still classified for national security reasons. I always wondered what he meant. Daniel felt a surge of validation. He was not imagining things. The evidence suggested that there was indeed more to Operation Northwoods than the public had been allowed to see. He began searching for records of Robert McNamara's testimony about Northwoods. In November 1995, McNamara had been interviewed by the Assassination Records Review Board as part of their investigation. A transcript of that interview existed, and Daniel was able to access it through a FOIA request. Most of the interview was straightforward. McNamara confirmed receiving the Northwoods memo, described his reaction to it as appalled, and stated that he had never seriously considered implementing any of its proposals. He said he had briefed President Kennedy on the memo and that Kennedy had rejected it immediately. But then, on page 47 of the transcript, there was this exchange. Interviewer: "Were there any other components to the Northwoods proposal beyond the specific operations described in the main memo, McNamara? I cannot discuss certain aspects of the proposal that remain classified." Interviewer: "The memo itself has been declassified. Are you saying there are parts of it that are still sealed?" McNamara: "I am saying that there were related materials and discussions that I am not authorized to address." Interviewer: "Can you at least tell us the general nature of these materials?" McNamara: "They dealt with alternative approaches, contingency planning, that is all I can say." The interviewer had pressed further, but McNamara refused to elaborate. The transcript showed him becoming increasingly uncomfortable. eventually stating flatly that he would not discuss that section of the operation regardless of what questions were asked. That section. As if there was a specific, defined portion of Northwoods that remained off limits, even in a closed-door interview with government investigators. Daniel made a note. McNamara knew about the addendum. He'd seen the extra pages, and he had been ordered to keep them secret. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Daniel had posted a query on an online forum used by researchers who specialised in declassified intelligence documents. He asked if anyone had encountered references to Contingency Gamma, or Gamma Framework, in Cold War-era files. 2 days later, he received a private message from someone using the username Mongoose77. The message was brief. "You're looking at Operation Mongoose. Check the cross-references. Item P5 and P6. They redacted the relevant sections, but the references are still there." Operation Mongoose was the CIA's covert sabotage program against Cuba, launched in November 1961 after the Bay of Pigs failure. It was run by Edward Lansdale, a legendary CIA operative, and it involved everything from economic sabotage to assassination attempts against Castro. Mongoose was real, documented, and had been extensively studied. Daniel went back through the declassified Mongoose files. The operation had multiple components, coded as P items. P1 dealt with sabotage of Cuban industrial facilities. P2 focused on infiltrating exile groups into Cuba. P3 and P4 covered various propaganda and intelligence gathering operations. P5 and P6 were listed in the operations index, but the actual content for both items was completely redacted. Page after page of black bars with only occasional phrases visible. Daniel could make out fragmentary references. Domestic perception, coordinated messaging, cleared media assets, narrative alignment. These were not sabotage operations. These were not about Cuba at all. They were about managing American public opinion. He found a notation at the bottom of one heavily redacted page. See also, J Chief's Contingency Planning, March 62, August 62. There it was, a direct connection between Operation Mongoose and the time frame, when Northwoods was drafted and rejected. P5 and P6 of Mongoose appeared to be linked to the Joint Chiefs Contingency Planning, from the exact period when the Northwoods Addendum would have been created. Daniel needed to find someone who had actually worked on Mongoose, someone who might know what P5 and P6 really were. It took him 3 months, but he finally located a former CIA analyst named Thomas Whitaker, who had worked under Lansdale during the Mongoose operation. Whitaker was in his 80s now, living in Northern Virginia, and he was willing to talk as long as Daniel promised not to record the conversation or publish anything that could be traced back to him. They met at a diner off Interstate 66 on a Sunday morning in October. Whitaker was thin, sharp-eyed, and immediately made clear that he would only discuss certain topics. "I worked on propaganda materials," Whitaker said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Radio broadcasts, leaflets, that kind of thing. Mongoose was mostly about making Castro's life difficult, but there were other components." "P5 and P6, Daniel said. Whitaker's expression did not change, but his hand stopped moving for just a moment. "You have done your homework." "What were they?" "Officially, Domestic Public Affairs Coordination. That was the bland language they used. But what it really meant was managing how Americans perceived the Cuba situation. Lansdale worked with people in the Pentagon, people in the media. The idea was to create a consistent narrative, make sure that when something happened with Cuba, the American public would interpret it the right way. The right way meaning favourably toward intervention. Exactly. It was not about making stuff up necessarily. It was about emphasis. Which stories got covered, which experts got quoted, which angles got pursued. We had journalists who would cooperate, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. We had academics who would publish papers supporting our position. We had people in Hollywood working on projects that would portray Cuba in certain ways. Daniel felt his pulse quickening. Did this have anything to do with Operation Northwoods? Whitaker sipped his coffee before answering. Northwoods was the Joint Chiefs baby, not ours. But yeah, there was overlap. After Kennedy killed Northwoods, some of the same thinking migrated over to Mongoose. The idea that you did not need a big dramatic incident to get public support. You could build it gradually, shape perception over time. Someone once told me that Northwoods was not really about Cuba, Daniel said carefully. They said it was about learning how far you could bend the American mind. Whittaker met his eyes for a long moment. Then he looked down at his coffee. Whoever told you that understood the real game. Cuba was the excuse. The actual experiment was whether you could manufacture public consent for just about anything, if you controlled the narrative. And the answer, we discovered, was yes. You absolutely could. The conspiracy twist. Daniel's research had taken him from a misfiled folder in the archives to a disturbing conclusion. Operation Northwoods had not died when Kennedy rejected it. The specific proposals for false flag terrorism had been shelved, but the underlying concept, the Gamma framework, had been implemented through other channels. But the story went deeper than that, and darker. Daniel found the next piece in one of the most unlikely places. A half-destroyed file pulled from a private document collection being donated to a library in Baltimore. The collection had belonged to a retired Department of Defense analyst who had passed away. His family was sorting through boxes of old papers, most of them routine bureaucratic materials, when they found a folder marked Northwoods-related -personal notes. The family donated the collection to a local university library, and Daniel only learned about it because he had set up automated alerts for any new archival materials mentioning Northwoods. He drove to Baltimore the day after the collection was processed and spent an afternoon going through the dead analyst's papers. Most of it was exactly what you would expect: memos, reports, meeting notes. But tucked into a folder about budget hearings from 1962 was a single page that appeared to have survived a fire. The edges were burned, the paper was brittle, and perhaps 1/3 of the text was missing. What remained was enough to make Daniel's hands shake. The document appeared to be from the Office of Naval Intelligence, dated June 1962. The top half was mostly burned away, but the bottom section was partially readable. It contained a list of names, approximately 20 of them, with notations beside each one. The names included journalists from CBS, ABC, the Miami Herald, the Washington Post, and several other major news organizations. Next to each name was a phrase: verified cooperative, cleared for contingency Gamma operations. Some of these journalists, Daniel realized with growing shock, had gone on to become extremely prominent in American media. Network anchors, editorial boards, people whose reporting had shaped how millions of Americans understood major events for decades. And in 1962 they had apparently been identified as cooperative with a Pentagon psychological operation. Daniel photographed the damaged document with trembling hands. He spent the next week trying to verify its authenticity, consulting paper experts and handwriting analysts. The paper was consistent with ONI documents from that era. The typewriter font matched those used in government offices in the early 60s. The document appeared to be genuine. But what did it mean? Had these journalists knowingly cooperated with a government propaganda operation? Or had they simply been identified as people whose reporting tended to align with Pentagon preferences? Either way, the implications were staggering. Daniel found another connection in the most disturbing place possible: a fire report from October 1962. A CIA safe house in northwest Washington, used for operations related to Cuba, had burned in what was officially ruled an electrical malfunction. The fire destroyed most of the documents stored there, which officially included operational planning materials related to Cuban exile coordination. But Daniel found a letter in the State Department archives from a CIA logistics officer complaining about the fire. The letter mentioned that materials related to Gamma psychological programming had been lost in the blaze and would need to be recreated from backup copies held elsewhere. Gamma psychological programming, there was that word again. The fire happened in October 1962, 7 months after Kennedy rejected Northwoods, 5 months after Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. If Gamma had been killed along with the rest of Northwoods, why would there be materials about it in an active CIA safe house months later? And why would those materials need to be recreated? Daniel pulled Federal Aviation Administration records from 1963, looking for anything unusual. He found 2 incidents that made his blood freeze. In April 1963, the FAA recorded what was described as a fabricated hijack transmission test. According to the incident report, a military aircraft had broadcast a fake distress call claiming to be a hijacked civilian plane. The test was allegedly part of emergency response protocols, but the specific phrasing in the report was almost identical to language in the Northwoods memo about simulating hijacking incidents. In July 1963, the FAA recorded a controlled civilian panic response drill at Miami International Airport. Again, the report described it as a training exercise, but the scenario involved simulating a Cuban attack on a commercial aircraft and measuring how passengers and airport personnel would respond. These were not random drills. These were simulations of the exact scenarios described in Operation Northwoods. Why would the military and FAA be running drills based on a plan that Kennedy had supposedly killed more than a year earlier? Unless parts of Northwoods, particularly the Gamma framework, had never actually been killed at all. Daniel began digging into what happened to General Lemnitzer after he was reassigned to NATO. Official history has portrayed this as a standard rotation, a prestigious assignment. But Daniel found internal memos suggesting that Lemnitzer had continued to meet with CIA officials about Cuba policy even after leaving his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In September 1962, Lemnitzer met with CIA Deputy Director Marshall Carter. In October, he met with Richard Helms, then in charge of the CIA's Covert Operations Division. In November 1962, he attended a meeting at CIA headquarters in Langley with several Joint Chiefs staff officers and senior CIA officials. The meetings were logged, but the subjects were not recorded. They were classified under a special category that even decades later remained partially sealed. Why was a general who had supposedly been sidelined for pushing an extreme covert operation continuing to meet with the CIA about Cuba? What were they discussing in those meetings? Daniel found a partial answer in a collection of personal papers donated by a retired Air Force colonel who had served on the Joint Chiefs staff. Among routine correspondence was a memo from December 1962, marked Eyes Only from Lemnitzer to a small group of recipients. The memo read, "Gamma implementation proceeding as planned despite presidential obstruction. Mongoose coordination effective. Estimate 12 to 18 months for full domestic narrative shift. Cuban crisis provides excellent testing ground for perception management techniques. Domestic narrative shift. Perception management techniques. They had not abandoned the Gamma framework. They were actively implementing it without presidential authorization." And then Daniel found the connection that researchers had whispered about for decades but could never quite prove. The Dallas connection. In 1976, a former CIA officer named Victor Marchetti published an article about the Kennedy assassination that included a provocative statement. Marchetti wrote, "A rare discussion of assassination at high levels came about in response to allegations by a Pentagon officer. The story was investigated by the CIA, and by the time we were through, we were convinced there was nothing to it. But the story is still fascinating. The gist of the story was that the officer said President Kennedy was killed by elements within the government." Years later, in an interview, Marchetti elaborated slightly. "I cannot prove anything, but I can tell you that if you investigate Operation Northwoods deeply enough, all roads eventually lead to Dallas." It was a cryptic statement, and Marchetti had never provided any concrete evidence. Most researchers dismissed it as speculative conspiracy thinking. But Daniel could not stop thinking about the timeline. March 1962, Kennedy rejects Operation Northwoods. August 1962, Lemnitzer is removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. October 1962, materials related to Gamma framework are referenced in an active CIA safe house. November 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. It proved nothing. Correlation is not causation. But the pattern was unsettling, especially given what Daniel had learned about Gamma's implementation continuing despite presidential rejection. He found something else in the archives that made the timeline even more disturbing. In September 1963, just 2 months before Kennedy's assassination, the Joint Chiefs held a special meeting about Cuba policy. The meeting was attended by all the chiefs, plus several Pentagon officials and 2 representatives from the CIA. The minutes from that meeting were mostly declassified, but one section remained redacted. All Daniel could see was discussion of contingency planning for post-Castro scenario, reference to redacted implementation strategies from March 62 planning documents. March 62 was when Northwoods was drafted. Post-Castro scenario suggested planning for what would happen after Castro was removed from power. But why would they be referencing planning documents from March 62 unless those documents contained strategies that were still considered relevant? Daniel found one more piece, and this one chilled him to the bone. In the National Security Archive, a collection of declassified documents at George Washington University, there was a memo from McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, to the president dated October 1963. The memo was brief. Mr. President, per your inquiry about ongoing Cuba operations, I have confirmed that certain military planning activities continue without NSC oversight. I recommend immediate review and possible intervention. Kennedy died less than a month later. There is no record that any review was ever conducted. What military planning activities was Bundy referring to? Why were they operating without NSC oversight? And why did Kennedy apparently only learn about them in October 1963? Daniel could not prove it, but the evidence suggested a disturbing possibility. After Kennedy rejected Northwoods and removed Lemnitzer, certain elements within the military and intelligence establishment continued implementing parts of the plan, particularly the Gamma Psychological Operations Framework, without presidential knowledge or approval. They had decided that manufacturing public consent for Cuba policy was too important to let something like presidential authority get in the way. And when Kennedy started asking questions about unauthorized operations in the weeks before his death, Daniel did not want to finish that thought. But he could not stop thinking about Victor Marchetti's words, all roads eventually lead to Dallas. The modern version. Daniel's investigation had taken him from 1962 to 1963, tracing how Operation Northwoods appeared to evolve from a rejected proposal into an active psychological operation. But the story did not end there. In fact, it might not have ended at all. In December 2001, Daniel received an anonymous email. The sender used an obviously fake name and an encrypted email service. The message contained no text, just an attachment, a scanned PDF of what appeared to be a government memo. Daniel ran every security check he could think of before opening it. The PDF was clean. What it contained was explosive. The document was dated September 2002, 1 year after the September 11th attacks. It appeared to be from an office within the Department of Defense called Strategic Communications and Information Operations. The memo was addressed to multiple recipients whose names were redacted. The subject line read, Gamma Continuity - Narrative Alignment Protocols. There was that word again. Gamma. The memo discussed perception management strategies for maintaining public support for military operations. It talked about cooperative media relationships, academic outreach programs, and entertainment industry coordination. It mentioned emotional event design and behavioral priming. The language was more sophisticated than the 1962 documents, more dressed up in social science terminology. But the underlying concept was the same, systematically shaping how Americans perceived military and foreign policy issues. One section read, building on frameworks established during Cold War operations, particularly the Gamma protocols from Cuba planning, modern perception management can leverage digital media and real-time communication to achieve more rapid and comprehensive narrative adoption than previously possible. Building on frameworks established during Cold War operations, Gamma protocols from Cuba planning, they were openly referencing Northwoods-era techniques, updated for the 21st century. Daniel could not verify the document's authenticity. The sender never responded to his attempts at contact, but he began looking for other evidence that something like the Gamma framework might be operating in the modern era. he found it in unexpected places. In 2004, he discovered a Department of Defense contract with a private communications firm to provide strategic messaging coordination for the Iraq War. The contract mentioned embedding narrative frameworks in media coverage and coordinating expert commentary across multiple platforms. In 2008, he found National Security Council emails discussing perception management strategies for the financial crisis. The emails referenced controlled information releases and coordinating with cleared media contacts. In 2012, he found State Department documents about strategic communications for the Libyan intervention that used phrases almost identical to the 1962 Northwoods Addendum. Psychological continuity, narrative conditioning, emotional framework establishment. The terminology had evolved, the techniques had become more sophisticated, but the basic approach, using coordinated psychological operations to shape domestic public opinion, appeared to be standard practice. Daniel began reaching out to people who might know more: Pentagon communications officers, retired CIA analysts, academics who studied propaganda and media manipulation. Most would not talk. A few would speak off the record, and they painted a disturbing picture. One former Pentagon official told Daniel, "Every administration does this. They call it different things: public affairs, strategic communications, information operations. But it is all the same basic playbook. You figure out what narrative you want the public to believe, and then you use every tool available to embed that narrative in the media environment. It is not a conspiracy. It is just how modern government works." A retired NSA analyst was more blunt. Northwoods was amateur hour compared to what we can do now. Back then they had to rely on a few journalists and radio broadcasts. Now we have social, media, algorithmic content promotion, coordinated influencer networks. We can shape perception at scale in ways those guys in the 60s could not have imagined. In 2014, Daniel found the most direct connection. He was reviewing FOIA requests related to the CIA's communications office when he came across a training manual for information operations officers. The manual was heavily redacted, but one section that remained visible was titled Historical Frameworks for Domestic Perception Management. It contained a case study. The case study was Operation Northwoods. The manual described Northwoods as an early attempt at comprehensive narrative control that failed due to operational exposure and political resistance. It then stated, modern operations benefit from lessons learned, particularly the importance of A. Maintaining operational security, B. Implementing gradual conditioning rather than dramatic events, C. Utilizing distributed influence networks rather than centralized control. It was Gamma, the exact approach described in the Northwoods Addendum from 1962, and the CIA was teaching it as a case study for modern information operations. Daniel realized something chilling. Operation Northwoods had not been rejected. Not really. The specific proposals for false flag terrorism had been too extreme, too risky, too likely to be exposed. But the underlying concept, the Gamma framework for manipulating public perception, had been validated and refined over 6 decades. It had become standard procedure. Daniel's discovery and disappearance. By 2015, Daniel had compiled more than 2,000 pages of documents, memos, emails, and interviews, tracing the evolution of the Gamma framework from its origins in Operation Northwoods to its apparent modern implementation. He had built a comprehensive case that psychological operations for domestic perception management had been continuous government policy since at least the early 1960s. He decided to publish his findings. He contacted several journalists, offered his research to documentary filmmakers, and prepared a comprehensive report that could be released online. That is when things started to go wrong. In July 2015, Daniel's apartment was broken into. Nothing obvious was stolen. His television was still there. His laptop was still there. But his file cabinets had been opened and his documents had been disturbed. Someone had gone through his physical files. Fortunately, Daniel had anticipated something like this. All his important materials were backed up on encrypted drives stored in multiple locations. The break-in was unsettling, but not catastrophic. 2 weeks later, 2 men appeared at his door, claiming to be from something called the Department of Defense Records Integrity Program. They wore suits and carried identification that looked official. They said there had been concerns about improperly accessed materials from the National Archives, and they needed to verify that Daniel did not possess any classified documents. Daniel refused to let them in. He asked for their names and contact information so he could verify their credentials. They became insistent, saying they had legal authority to inspect his materials. Daniel told them to come back with a warrant. They left. Daniel immediately called the main Department of Defense information number and asked about the Records Integrity Program. After being transferred 3 times, he finally reached someone who told him no such program existed. He filed a police report about the incident, but nothing came of it. In September, Daniel finally finished compiling his research into a comprehensive document. It was more than 300 pages long, meticulously sourced, with scanned copies of key documents embedded throughout. He titled it, "Gamma Was Never About Cuba: How Operation Northwoods Became Standard American Policy." He planned to release it online on October 1st. He sent advance copies to several journalists and researchers. He encrypted the main file and prepared to upload it to multiple document sharing sites. On September 28th, Daniel uploaded a short preview to his personal website. The preview described his findings about the Northwoods Addendum and mentioned that the full report would be available within days. The preview was online for approximately 6 hours before his website was taken down by what his hosting company described as a terms of service violation. They would not specify what terms he had violated. When he tried to contact them for clarification, his account had been suspended and his data was no longer accessible. Daniel had backups. He tried uploading the preview to other platforms. Within 24 hours, his accounts on 3 different document sharing sites were suspended. No explanation was given. On September 30th, the day before his planned full release, Daniel received an encrypted email from the same anonymous address that had sent him the 2002 memo years earlier. This time there was a message. They know what you have. They know what you plan to release. It will not be allowed. Recommend you reconsider. This is not a threat. This is a warning from someone who understands the system. Daniel did not reconsider. On the evening of September 30th, he uploaded encrypted copies of his full report to multiple servers, sent password-protected versions to more than 50 journalists and researchers, and posted the decryption key on several online forums. He went to sleep that night believing his work would finally be public. Daniel Reeves was never heard from again. On October 1st, colleagues tried to contact him and received no response. His phone went straight to voicemail. Emails bounced back as undeliverable. When friends went to his apartment on October 2nd, they found it completely empty. All his furniture was gone. All his documents were gone. The apartment was vacant, as if no one had ever lived there. His landlord said Daniel had sent an email on September 30th saying he was breaking his lease effective immediately and would forfeit his security deposit. The email came from Daniel's account, but none of his friends believed he'd sent it. The few journalists who had received his report found that their copies had been corrupted. The files would not open. The encrypted versions were intact, but Daniel had never sent out the decryption key. Or if he had, none of them received it. The posts containing the key on online forums had been deleted. Within a week, it was as if Daniel Reeves and his research had never existed. But there was one thing that survived. A researcher in California who had corresponded with Daniel had printed out a draft version of the Northwoods Addendum pages before Daniel disappeared. He scanned the printout and posted it anonymously to a conspiracy theory website. Most people who saw it dismissed it as fake. It had no verification, no chain of custody, nothing to prove its authenticity. It looked like just another hoax document. But at the bottom of page 6 of the addendum, there was a sentence that some people read and could never quite forget. Control perception, and you control reality. We must ensure public consent even when they cannot see the truth. The conspiracy theory community debated for years about whether the Daniel Reeves story was real. No one could prove it either way. His social security number showed no activity after September 2015. His credit cards went dormant. His driver's license expired and was never renewed. His family, when contacted, said they had not heard from him and assumed he had left the country. But once in a while, someone on an obscure forum would post, "What if Northwoods never really ended? What if Daniel was right?" And then, in the late 2010s, people started noticing patterns. The way news stories about military interventions were covered. The way expert commentary seemed coordinated across multiple platforms. The way certain narratives appeared simultaneously in newspapers, on cable news, in think tank reports, in academic papers. It did not prove anything. It could all be coincidence or just the natural way that modern media ecosystems work. But some people remembered Daniel's research. They remembered the Gamma framework. They remembered that the government had once seriously proposed terrorizing its own citizens to manufacture consent for war. And they wondered, if they were willing to propose that then, what would they be willing to actually do now? Epilogue. In the fall of 2023, an anonymous package arrived at the offices of an investigative journalism nonprofit in Washington. The package contained a single sheet of paper, aged and yellowed, printed on the kind of onion skin carbon copy paper that government offices used in the 1960s. At the top of the page were 2 words, Contingency Gamma. Below that was a single paragraph. Gamma represents the final evolution of psychological warfare, turned inward upon the sponsoring population. The successful implementation of Gamma makes traditional false flag operations unnecessary. When perception is controlled at the narrative level, reality becomes irrelevant. The public will support any policy, accept any explanation, believe any official story provided the psychological framework has been properly established. This is not deception. This is the architecture of modern governance. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note, dated September 30, 2015. Northwoods never ended. It simply went underground. The note was unsigned, but handwriting analysis would later suggest it matched samples of Daniel Reeves' writing. The journalism organisation verified the paper was consistent with government documents from the 1960s. They could not verify anything else. They published the image online with a full disclaimer about its uncertain provenance. It went viral for approximately 48 hours. Then it was flagged as misinformation by major social media platforms, and its reach was limited. Within a week, most people had forgotten about it. But in a small apartment in College Park, Maryland, a graduate student working on her dissertation was reviewing records from the National Archives. She was looking through recently declassified files from the early 2000s. In a box of routine communications, she found a Department of Defense memo from 2016. The memo discussed information operations frameworks and mentioned historical continuity with Cold War-era perception management protocols. It contained one sentence that made her pause. Gamma principles remain foundational to modern strategic communications doctrine. She thought about requesting more information. She thought about digging deeper. Then she remembered the story of the researcher who had disappeared after investigating Operation Northwoods. She had always assumed it was an internet legend, the kind of creepy story conspiracy theorists tell each other. But now she was not so sure. She closed the file and moved on to the next box. Some things, she decided, were better left alone, and somewhere, in classified files that will not be declassified for another 50 years, a framework labelled Gamma continues to operate. The techniques are more sophisticated now, the technology is more advanced, the coordination is more seamless, but the basic principle remains unchanged. Control perception, and you control reality. Operation Northwoods was never really about Cuba. It was never really about false flag terrorism. It was about learning how to manufacture consent, how to shape reality itself, how to make people believe whatever you need them to believe. And they succeeded. Not in 1962, when the proposal was too crude, too obvious, too risky, but gradually, quietly, invisibly, until it became so normal, so ubiquitous, so woven into the fabric of modern life, that most people would never even think to question it. That is what Daniel Reeves discovered. That is what he tried to tell us, and that is why he disappeared. Because the truth about Operation Northwoods is not that it failed. The truth is that it succeeded beyond anyone's wildest imagination. It just took 60 years, and we are all living inside it now. The coffee cup trembles in my weathered hands as I speak these words for the first time in 53 years. My name is Detective Raymond Kowalski, retired SFPD, and I'm dying. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. But luck ran out for me the day I opened that damned Alcatraz file. They said Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The FBI closed the case. The warden slept easy. America's most infamous prison maintained its perfect record. But I found things I was never meant to see, things that made me understand why some truths are buried deeper than bodies. This is my confession. Not of crimes I committed, but of the crime I witnessed. The systematic erasure of 3 men who may have pulled off the impossible, only to disappear into something far worse than death. If you're listening to this recording, it means I'm gone, and maybe, just maybe, the truth can finally surface from the depths where it's been drowning all these years. It was October 1968 when Lieutenant Carson dropped the manila folder on my desk like it was radioactive. 6 years had passed since the escape, and the case was supposedly closed, filed away with all the other solved mysteries that kept the bureaucrats sleeping soundly. "Formality, Kowalski," Carson said, not meeting my eyes. "Washington wants a final review of the Alcatraz evidence. Dot the I's, cross the T's, confirm what we already know. They're fish food at the bottom of the bay." I should have known something was wrong by the way he said it. Carson was a straight shooter, the kind of cop who looked you in the eye when he talked. But that day, he stared at the wall behind me like the words might crawl off it and bite him. The file was thinner than I expected for the most famous prison break in American history. Basic escape details, witness statements from guards, the makeshift raft materials found on Angel Island. Nothing I hadn't read in the newspapers. Too clean, too neat. "Why me?" I asked. Carson finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Because you're thorough, maybe too thorough. They want this done right." He left me with those cryptic words and a growing certainty that this formality was anything but routine. I started with the obvious inconsistencies. The first was a car theft report from Marina District, filed 3 days after the escape. A 1959 Chevrolet, stolen from outside a boarding house. The owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, told police she saw 3 men walking away from the vehicle, heading toward the waterfront. When she called out to them, one turned and tipped his hat. "Polite as you please." "They had manners," she told the responding officer. "Real gentlemen. You don't expect that from criminals." The report was buried on page 47 of miscellaneous incident files. No follow-up, no investigation, no mention in the official Alcatraz case summary. Then there was the paddle, a crude wooden oar carved from driftwood, found by a fisherman near Richmond Bridge, 20 miles upriver from where the currents should have carried any debris. The fisherman, Miguel Santos, reported it to park rangers, who logged it as miscellaneous beach debris. No connection made to the escape, despite the timing and craftsmanship that clearly showed prison workshop techniques. But it was the witness statement that made my blood run cold. A night security guard at Fisherman's Wharf reported seeing 3 men in work clothes boarding a small fishing boat around 4 a.m. on June 12th. One of them had distinctive ears, prominent, almost pointed, just like John Anglin's mugshot description. The guard's statement was taken, filed, and apparently forgotten. When I tried to interview him, I learned he'd quit his job 2 weeks after the incident and moved back to Oregon. No forwarding address. "Don't dig too deep on this one, Ray," Carson warned me when I briefed him on my preliminary findings. "Some stones are better left unturned." That's when I knew I was onto something bigger than a prison break. The Anglin family farm in Ruskin, Florida felt like stepping into a different century. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the humid air carried the scent of orange blossoms and old secrets. Robert Anglin, the surviving brother, met me on the front porch with the wary eyes of a man who'd been expecting bad news for 6 years. "Federal agents been by here 4 times, he said without preamble, each time asking the same questions, getting the same answers. "My brother's drowned. That's what you want to hear, ain't it?" But his wife, Marie, had different ideas. After Robert went to tend the cattle, she pulled me aside in her kitchen, glancing nervously at the windows. "Christmas cards," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. "Every year since '63, no return address, just signed J&C in handwriting that looks mighty familiar." She showed me a shoebox filled with holiday cards, generic drugstore variety, postmarked from different cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Mexico City. The handwriting was careful, disguised, but there were telltale loops and slants that matched samples I'd obtained from the prison records. "Why haven't you told the FBI?" I asked. Marie's laugh was bitter. "You think we haven't tried? First agent said they were hoaxes. Second one confiscated them as evidence. Third one threatened to charge us with obstruction if we kept spreading false hope. These here are copies I made before they took the originals." Photographs came out next. 3 pictures, slightly blurry, showing 2 men in work shirts standing outside what appeared to be a South American cantina. The faces were partially obscured by shadows and hat brims, but the bone structure, the posture, the way one man favoured his left leg, it all matched the Anglin brothers' physical profiles. Woman from church. Her daughter married a missionary. Sent these from Brazil in '65, Marie explained. Said these 2 Americans worked construction jobs, paid cash, kept to themselves, spoke English with Florida accents. I studied the photos with a magnifying glass. The man on the left had a distinctive scar on his forearm, a scar I remembered from Clarence Anglin's prison medical records, sustained in a workshop accident at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. "FBI says they're look-alikes," Marie continued. "Coincidence, but a mother knows her son's detective. Even in shadows, even across oceans, those are my boys." The fear in her eyes wasn't the fear of grief or false hope. It was the fear of someone who knew more than she was saying, someone who'd been warned to keep quiet. As I left the farm that evening, I noticed a dark sedan parked down the country road, 2 figures visible in the front seats. When I drove past, they turned away, but not before I caught a glimpse of federal license plates. The Anglins were being watched. After 6 years, the dead men's family was still under surveillance. That night in my motel room, I spread out everything I'd gathered so far. The car theft, the paddle, the witness statements, the cards and photographs. Individually, they could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. Together, they painted a picture that made my hands shake as I wrote my preliminary report. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't drowned in San Francisco Bay. They'd made it to shore, stolen transportation, and somehow managed to disappear into the wind. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether they'd survived the escape, It was why the government was so determined to pretend they hadn't. The National Archives building in Washington, D.C. has the kind of institutional grandeur designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As I walked through its marble corridors in November 1968, carrying my credentials and a growing list of questions, I felt exactly as intended. The records clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the pallor of someone who spent his days in basement filing rooms, greeted my request with practiced bureaucratic indifference. Alcatraz escape files? Let me check the catalogue. He disappeared into the labyrinthine storage system, returning 20 minutes later with a puzzled frown. That's odd. The primary files show as transferred to federal custody in 1964, no longer available for review. Transferred where? Doesn't say. Just lists the authorization code. Project Paperclip Archive classified. Project Paperclip. Even a street cop from San Francisco knew that designation. The program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II. Why would an escape case be filed under intelligence classifications? What about the secondary files, witness statements, evidence logs? Another search, another apologetic shrug. Also transferred, same authorization. I spent 3 days in Washington, following leads that turned to smoke and asking questions that generated only nervous silence. At FBI headquarters, my request for case consultation was politely denied. At the Bureau of Prisons, I was told the relevant personnel were unavailable for comment. Even my police credentials and Lieutenant Carson's authorization letters seemed to carry no weight. It was Agent Patricia Hendricks, a bureau analyst I'd worked with on a previous case, who finally gave me the truth over drinks in a Georgetown bar. She waited until we were alone, until the other patrons had cleared out, until even the bartender was busy with inventory in the back room. "Ray, you need to drop this," she said quietly, her usual professional demeanour replaced by genuine concern. "The Alcatraz case isn't cold, it's radioactive." "What does that mean?" Patricia glanced around the empty bar before continuing. Internal memo came down in 65. Any agent pursuing Alcatraz leads beyond the official drowning conclusion would be transferred to Alaska or worse. 3 agents have been quietly reassigned since then. Good agents, career agents, all because they asked too many questions about 3 supposedly dead men. Why? If they drowned like the report says, what's the threat? Her laugh was hollow. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? All I know is that certain people in very high places want Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers to stay dead, and they're willing to destroy careers to keep it that way. She slid an envelope across the table. I couldn't get you the files, but I managed to copy some of the index pages before they were sealed. Names, dates, reference numbers. Maybe you can piece together what we're not supposed to know. The documents were fragmentary, frustratingly incomplete, but they told a story that made my blood run cold. Cross-references to CIA front companies, mentions of asset recovery protocol, transfer authorization signed by officials whose names I recognized from the intelligence community. Most disturbing was a memo dated July 1962, just 1 month after the escape. Subjects may possess operational value. Recommend immediate field assessment rather than standard fugitive protocols. Operational value, not the language you'd use for bank robbers and car thieves. That night, in my Washington hotel room, I called Lieutenant Carson to report my findings. The conversation was brief and cryptic. "Ray, you need to come home. Now. I've got leads here, Lieutenant. Real leads. The leads will be there when you get back. If you get back. There are people asking questions about your questions, and those people have resources we don't. Come home." The line went dead. I packed quickly, checking the hallway twice before leaving my room. During the taxi ride to the airport, I noticed the same black sedan in my mirrors that had followed me from the archives building 3 days earlier. Back in San Francisco, Carson met me at the airport personally, something he'd never done before. His first words were a warning. "Your hotel room was searched yesterday. Professional job. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but they wanted you to know they'd been there." As we drove through the city, he filled me in on developments from my end. Miguel Santos, the fisherman who found the paddle, died in a car accident outside Portland last week. Single vehicle collision on a straight road, clear weather, and Mrs. Hutchins, the lady who saw the car theft, moved to Phoenix, left no forwarding address. Her old neighbours say federal agents visited her the day before she left. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone connected to evidence contradicting the official narrative was disappearing, voluntarily or otherwise. The Alcatraz case wasn't just closed, it was being actively suppressed by people with resources and authority I couldn't match. "What do I do, Lieutenant?" Carson pulled over and turned to face me. In 30 years of police work, I'd never seen him look so serious. "You write a report confirming the drowning theory. You file it properly. You forget everything you've learned, and you pray that's enough to keep you breathing." But I couldn't forget. The faces in those photographs. The fear in Mary Anglin's eyes. The systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. Somewhere out there, the truth was buried so deep that powerful people were willing to destroy lives to keep it hidden. The question was whether I was brave enough, or stupid enough, to keep digging. Tony the Fish Marconi wasn't the kind of informant you'd find in a police procedural manual. A small-time smuggler with ties to both San Francisco's waterfront and various federal agencies that preferred not to be named, Tony survived by knowing when to talk and when to disappear. When he agreed to meet me at a dive bar in North Beach, I knew the information would be worth the risk. "You're playing with fire, Detective," he said, stirring his whiskey with a nicotine-stained finger. "The Alcatraz thing? That ain't just a prison break, that's connected to some heavy government business." "What kind of business?" Tony glanced around the dim bar, noting the exits, the other patrons, the bartender's attention. Old habits from a life lived in the shadows. "You ever hear of something called the Prometheus Group?" I shook my head. "Private contractors, black budget operations, the kind of people who make problems disappear for Uncle Sam. Word on the street is they were running recruitment out of the Bay Area in the early 60s, looking for specific types, intelligent, adaptable, morally flexible, men who'd already proven they could operate outside the law." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying Morris and the Anglins were recruited?" "I'm saying Morris had an IQ of 133 and a talent for planning that impressed even the prison psychologists. The Anglin brothers were mechanical geniuses who could improvise solutions from scrap metal and determination. During the Cold War, those were valuable skills." Tony drained his whiskey and signalled for another. "Think about it. 3 men plan the perfect escape from America's most secure prison. They disappear without a trace, despite the biggest manhunt in federal history. Either they're criminal masterminds beyond anything we've seen, or they had help. Professional help. What kind of help? The kind that comes with new identities, transportation, and assignments in places where questions aren't asked. South America was crawling with intelligence operations in the 60s. Cuba, Chile, Brazil. All potential flashpoints that needed experienced operators who couldn't be traced back to Washington. The theory was insane, but it explained the evidence I'd uncovered. The systematic suppression of information, the classified file transfers, the fear I'd encountered at every level of government. If the Alcatraz escape had been a recruitment operation disguised as a prison break, then admitting the men survived would expose a covert program that violated everything America claimed to stand for. "There's another possibility," Tony continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Maybe they weren't recruited. Maybe they stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see." "Such as?" "Alcatraz was more than a prison, Detective. It was a research facility, mind control experiments, interrogation techniques, pharmaceutical trials, the kind of work that required subjects who couldn't complain to their congressman. What if Morris and the Anglins saw something during their time there? What if their escape wasn't about freedom, it was about exposure?" My mind reeled with the implications. If the escapees had witnessed classified experiments, their capture wouldn't result in a return to prison. It would result in permanent silence. "I've heard whispers," Tony continued. "Black sites in Nevada, facilities that don't appear on any government maps, places where inconvenient people go to be forgotten, the kind of places where 3 escaped prisoners might end up if they knew too much." He finished his second whiskey and stood to leave. "One more thing, Detective. You know why they call it the Prometheus Group?" I shook my head. "Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. The gods punished him by chaining him to a rock where eagles ate his liver for eternity. Some gifts come with a price that never stops being paid." After Tony left, I sat in that dim bar for another hour, trying to process what he'd told me. 3 theories, each more disturbing than the last. Theory 1. Cold War recruitment. The escape was facilitated by intelligence agencies looking for deniable assets. Morris and the Anglins were extracted, given new identities, and deployed to international hotspots where their criminal skills could serve national interests. Theory 2. Witness protection in reverse. The men had seen classified activities at Alcatraz and escaped to avoid being silenced. Their continued existence threatened to expose government programs that officially didn't exist. Theory 3. The darkest possibility. They were captured alive after the escape and disappeared into the black site system, spending the rest of their lives as test subjects or interrogation practice for intelligence agencies that viewed them as expendable assets. Each theory explained the evidence I'd gathered. Each theory justified the extreme measures taken to suppress the truth. And each theory meant that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers faced something far worse than drowning in San Francisco Bay. They faced erasure from history itself. 6 months later, against direct orders from Lieutenant Carson and my own better judgment, I found myself on a flight to Rio de Janeiro. The lead had come through Tony Marconi's network, a bartender in Ipanema who claimed to remember 2 American men matching the Anglin's description, regulars at his establishment from 1971 to 1978. They paid cash, spoke little Portuguese, and never talked about their past, the bartender Carlos told me through a translator. But they were different from other expatriates, more careful, always watching the exits, never sitting with their backs to the door. The description matched surveillance training, the kind of operational security taught to intelligence assets. Carlos produced a photograph taken during a Christmas party in 1975. A grainy image showing 2 men at the edge of the celebration, their faces partially obscured but their body language unmistakably American. My hands trembled as I studied the picture. The man on the left had the same jawline, the same ears, the same way of holding his shoulders that I'd memorized from Clarence Anglin's prison files. The other figure showed signs of premature aging, stress lines and grey hair that suggested a life lived under constant tension. "What happened to them?" I asked. Carlos's expression darkened. "They left suddenly, in the middle of the night. One day they were here, the next day their apartment was empty. The landlord said men in suits had come asking questions the week before, Americans but not tourists, government men." I spent another week in Rio following leads that grew colder with each passing day. The apartment building where the mystery Americans had lived was scheduled for demolition, its records mysteriously lost in a fire. The bank where they had allegedly maintained accounts had no record of American customers from that period. Every trail ended in convenient dead ends and missing documentation. On my final night in Brazil, I was approached by a man claiming to be a freelance journalist who'd been investigating the same story. We met at a beachside cafe in Copacabana, the sound of waves masking our conversation from potential surveillance. "You're the American detective asking about the Alcatraz escapees," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. I neither confirmed nor denied, waiting for him to continue. "I've been working this story for 3 years," he said, "following reports of American fugitives throughout South America. The trail is real, detective, too real. These men lived here, worked here, built lives here. But every time I get close to proof, the sources disappear. Witnesses relocate. Documents vanish. I've had my hotel room searched, my phone tapped, my sources intimidated." He slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is everything I've gathered. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, hidden in different locations for 3 years, copied and recopied to prevent loss. It's yours now." "Why?" "Because I'm done." Yesterday, I received a visit from 2 men with American accents and no identification. They politely suggested that my investigation was endangering people I cared about. They showed me photographs of my sister's children playing in a park in Sao Paulo. Very clear photographs. Very recent photographs. The envelope contained a treasure trove of evidence. Bank records showing regular deposits to accounts held by men with obviously false Brazilian identities. employment records from construction companies that had hired American workers without proper documentation, hotel registries with signatures that bore striking resemblances to handwriting samples I'd obtained from Alcatraz. Most compelling was a photograph dated 1976 showing 3 men at a construction site in the Amazon basin. 2 matched the Anglin brothers' physical descriptions. The third was older, lean, with the kind of penetrating stare I remembered from Frank Morris's mugshot. All 3 wore work clothes and hard hats, looking like ordinary labourers except for their distinctly American postures and expressions. But like every other lead I'd followed, this one ended in frustration and fear. When I tried to contact the construction company, I learned it had been dissolved in 1979. The site where the photograph was taken was now underwater, flooded by a dam project that had relocated the entire local population. The pattern was always the same. Evidence of survival followed by systematic elimination of that evidence. Either I was chasing ghosts or someone with vast resources was staying one step ahead of every investigation. My flight back to San Francisco was delayed by mysterious mechanical problems. During the 6-hour layover in Mexico City, I noticed the same 2 men in different locations throughout the terminal. Always at a distance, always watching, never making direct contact. When I finally boarded the plane, they weren't among the passengers. Lieutenant Carson met me at San Francisco International with news that made my blood run cold. Federal marshals raided your apartment yesterday, Ray. Warrant signed by a judge I've never heard of, for evidence in a case they wouldn't specify. They took everything. Your files, your notes, your photographs, everything connected to Alcatraz. In the car ride home, he handed me an official-looking document. Transfer orders, effective immediately. You're being reassigned to the robbery division. Your Alcatraz investigation is officially terminated. On whose authority? Authority high enough that questioning it would end both our careers. Carson's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Ray, I've been a cop for 28 years. I've seen corruption, cover-ups, and conspiracies, but I've never seen anything like this. The pressure to shut you down is coming from levels of government I didn't know existed. He pulled over in a secluded area of Golden Gate Park and turned to face me directly. Whatever you found down there, whatever you think you know, it's not worth your life. These people have made careers disappear for asking the wrong questions. They can make people disappear too. As he spoke, a black sedan with government plates drove slowly past us, its occupants clearly visible through tinted windows that somehow allowed us to see their faces while hiding their expressions. The message was unmistakable. We were being watched, our conversation monitored, our future actions carefully noted. That night, alone in my ransacked apartment, I realised the full scope of what I was up against. This wasn't just a cover-up of a prison escape. It was the systematic suppression of a truth so dangerous that the most powerful government in the world was willing to destroy lives to protect it. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers hadn't just escaped from Alcatraz. They'd escaped into a shadow world where truth became enemy of the state, where survival meant accepting lies, and where the greatest prison of all was the silence that surrounded their fate. But silence, I was beginning to understand, has its own way of speaking to those willing to listen. 25 years passed like pages torn from a calendar and scattered by the wind. I worked robbery division, collected my pension, and tried to convince myself that some truths were better left buried. The Alcatraz case became a ghost that haunted my dreams, 3 faces staring at me from the depths of San Francisco Bay, asking why I'd abandoned the search for their story. Then came January 2013, and a letter that changed everything. The History Channel documentary was running old Alcatraz footage when the phone rang. It was my former partner, Jimmy Chen, now working cold cases for the FBI. His voice carried the excitement of a man who'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. Ray, you need to see this. Someone sent a letter to the Bureau claiming to be John Anglin. Says he's dying of cancer, wants to make a deal. Information about the escape in exchange for medical treatment. My hands shook as I read the photocopied letter Jimmy brought to my house that evening. The handwriting was shaky with age and illness, but certain flourishes matched the Christmas cards Marie Anglin had shown me decades earlier. The details were specific, accurate insider knowledge that only someone who'd lived through the escape could possess. "It's a hoax," Jimmy said, watching my reaction. "Has to be. FBI handwriting analysis says inconclusive. Could be authentic, could be someone who studied the case extensively." But I knew better. The letter wasn't just about the escape. It mentioned details that had never been made public. References to guard rotation patterns that were classified. Descriptions of cell modifications that weren't in any official report. Knowledge that could only come from someone who'd been there, who'd lived through those final months of preparation. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "The letter mentions a meeting place, coordinates in the Bay Area, where supposedly Frank Morris left something hidden before the escape. Information that was too dangerous to carry. The writer claims it's still there, waiting for someone brave enough to look." The coordinates led to a section of Angel Island State Park, near the spot where the makeshift raft materials had been found 51 years earlier. Against every instinct for self-preservation I'd developed, I found myself hiking those trails the following weekend, searching for something I couldn't name. It was hidden in a cave that didn't appear on any park maps, sealed behind rocks that looked natural but showed tool marks when examined closely. A waterproof container, military surplus from the 1960s, containing documents that made my blood run cold. Guard schedules from Alcatraz, annotated with personal notes about corruption and smuggling operations. Photographs of prison officials meeting with men in expensive suits who didn't appear in any government directories. Financial records showing payments from offshore accounts to wardens and guards who lived far beyond their official salaries. Most damning was a handwritten journal in Frank Morris's distinctive script, documenting what he'd witnessed during his time at Alcatraz. The prison wasn't just housing criminals, it was housing witnesses to government activities that violated constitutional protections. Political prisoners who'd been disappeared from the mainland. Foreign nationals being held without diplomatic notification. Test subjects for psychological experiments that would later be revealed as part of the MKUltra program. The final entry, dated 2 days before the escape, was prophetic in its certainty. We're not breaking out to be free, we're breaking out to stay alive. What we know, what we've seen, makes us more dangerous to them than any criminal they've ever housed. If we stay, we disappear quietly. If we escape and get caught, we disappear loudly. Our only chance is to vanish completely and hope the truth survives us. The documents explained everything. The official insistence on the drowning theory, the suppression of evidence, the systematic elimination of witnesses. The Alcatraz escape wasn't a crime to be solved. It was a national security incident to be contained. Morris and the Anglins hadn't just witnessed classified activities. They documented them, created a record of government crimes that could destroy careers and topple administrations. Their escape was both an act of desperation and a gamble that someday someone would be brave enough to tell their story. Reading those pages in the dim light of that hidden cave, I finally understood the true scope of the self-destruction paradox. The very actions taken to hide the truth had preserved it. The efforts to silence witnesses had created evidence. The attempts to erase history had documented it in detail. But understanding the truth and proving it were different challenges entirely. The men who'd orchestrated the cover-up were dead or retired, their crimes protected by classification systems and institutional amnesia. The witnesses were gone, scattered or silenced by 5 decades of systematic intimidation. Yet the letter kept haunting me. Someone claiming to be John Anglin, dying and desperate, reaching out across 50 years of silence to offer one final revelation. The FBI had dismissed it as a hoax, but their dismissal felt too quick, too certain, too reminiscent of the patterns I'd seen decades earlier. Late at night, when the pain in my chest reminded me of my own mortality, I wondered about the fates of 3 men who'd gambled everything on an impossible escape. Had they found freedom in the jungles of South America? Had they lived out their days under assumed names, carrying secrets too dangerous to share? Or had they been caught, disappeared into black sites where their knowledge died with them? The letter writer claimed John Anglin had survived into the 21st century, living with the weight of knowledge that could never be shared, watching as history branded him a criminal, while the real criminals wore badges and held office. If true, It was a torture more cruel than any prison cell, to know the truth and be unable to speak it, to carry justice in your heart while injustice wore your name. I kept the documents for 6 months before making my decision. They couldn't stay hidden. Too many people had died to protect these secrets, and too many others deserved to know the truth. But releasing them publicly would accomplish nothing except getting me killed and the evidence destroyed. Instead, I chose a different path. I copied everything, hid the copies in locations scattered across the country, and left instructions for their release upon my death. If the government wanted to suppress the truth, they'd have to do it posthumously, when I could no longer be intimidated or eliminated. The original documents I returned to their hiding place on Angel Island, along with my own written account of the investigation. Future generations might find them, might understand what they represented, might finally give Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers the justice they'd been denied for over half a century. But justice, I was learning, was a luxury the living could rarely afford. It was a gift we could only leave for the dead, a truth we could only speak when our own voices had been silenced. The morphine makes it difficult to focus, but I need to finish this recording while I still can. The doctors say hours now, maybe a day if I'm stubborn enough to fight the inevitable. I've been fighting for 78 years. What's one more battle against the darkness? I've spent 53 years carrying the weight of what I learned about Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. 53 years of waking up in cold sweats, wondering if today would be the day federal agents knocked on my door with a permanent solution to my inconvenient knowledge. 53 years of looking over my shoulder, checking my rearview mirror, and jumping at unexpected phone calls. The truth is a heavy burden when you're carrying it alone. I don't know if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lived out their days in Brazilian freedom, sipping caipirinhas on Ipanema Beach and laughing at the federal agents who'd spent decades searching for their corpses. I don't know if they died namelessly in some government facility, their final words lost in soundproof rooms designed to swallow screams. But I do know this with absolute certainty. They didn't drown in San Francisco Bay on June 11th, 1962. The evidence was always there for anyone brave enough to look past the official narrative. The car theft, the witness statements, the photographs from South America, the Christmas cards signed with familiar initials, each piece individually dismissed as coincidence or hoax, but collectively forming a picture of survival that powerful people needed to deny. The government's insistence on the drowning theory wasn't about maintaining Alcatraz's reputation or protecting prison security. It was about hiding activities that violated every principle America claimed to represent. The research programs, the intelligence operations, the systematic elimination of witnesses, all of it justified by national security classifications that turned constitutional protections into classified waste paper. Morris and the Anglins weren't just criminals who pulled off the perfect escape. They were inconvenient witnesses to state-sanctioned crimes, men whose continued existence threatened to expose a shadow government that operated beyond law, beyond oversight, beyond accountability. Their escape became their crime, their knowledge became their death sentence, their survival became a national security threat that required decades of cover-ups, intimidation, and murder to contain. I've left evidence of everything I'd discovered, hidden in multiple locations protected by legal arrangements that will trigger automatic release upon my death. Some truths are too important to die with the men who discover them. The morphine is winning now, and the room is getting darker. But before I fade away, I want to leave you with this final thought. Alcatraz was never escape-proof because its walls were too high or its waters too cold. It was escape-proof because the government made survival more dangerous than imprisonment, freedom more terrifying than captivity. The greatest prison isn't built with stone and steel. It's built with silence and fear, with official denials and convenient accidents, with careers destroyed and witnesses disappeared. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't die in San Francisco Bay. The Bay didn't kill them. The silence did. And silence. Silence is the strongest prison of all. But even silence eventually comes to an end. Recording ends with the sound of steady breathing that gradually grows fainter, until only the mechanical hum of hospital equipment remains. Found among Detective Raymond Kowalski's personal effects, along with detailed instructions for the release of sealed documents and recordings. To whoever finds this recording and follows the trail I've left behind, my name was Detective Raymond Kowalski, badge number 2847, San Francisco Police Department. I died on December 20th, 2021, at 3:17 a.m., alone except for the ghosts of 3 men whose story I spent a lifetime trying to tell. If you're reading this, it means the legal mechanisms I put in place have been triggered. Safety deposit boxes in 7 different states will have been opened. Law offices in 4 different cities will have released sealed documents. Digital files stored in multiple secure locations will have been automatically transmitted to journalists, historians, and government oversight committees. I've spent 53 years preparing for this moment, the moment when my voice could finally break the silence that has protected one of the greatest cover-ups in American history. The documents you now have access to represent only a fraction of what was hidden. For every piece of evidence I managed to preserve, dozens more were destroyed by people who understood that truth was their greatest enemy. But what remains is enough. Enough to prove that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived their escape from Alcatraz. Enough to demonstrate the systematic suppression of evidence by multiple government agencies. Enough to show that the official narrative was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect state secrets more valuable than human lives. I need you to understand something. The men who orchestrated this cover-up weren't comic book villains twirling their mustaches in shadowy rooms. They were patriots in their own minds. They believed that protecting classified operations was more important than acknowledging 3 escaped prisoners. They convinced themselves that national security justified any level of deception, any amount of witness intimidation, any degree of evidence suppression. They were wrong. In a democracy, truth cannot be classified indefinitely. Justice cannot be postponed forever. The families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers deserve to know their fates. The American people deserve to know what their government did in their name. History deserved an accurate record, not a convenient fiction. I've carried this burden alone because I was afraid of losing my pension, my reputation, my life, afraid of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or a disgruntled cop, afraid that speaking the truth would accomplish nothing except getting me killed. But fear, I've learned, is just another form of prison, and like Alcatraz itself, it's only escape-proof, as long as you believe the walls are stronger than your determination to break free. To the families of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, your loved ones were not the criminals history has made them out to be. They were witnesses to government crimes who paid the ultimate price for their knowledge. Whether they found freedom in South America or died in government custody, they deserved better than 50 years of official denial and systematic character assassination. To the government officials who will undoubtedly attempt to discredit these revelations, your time is over. The men who created this cover-up are dead. The operations they were protecting have been declassified or exposed through other channels. The only thing your continued denials accomplish is further damage to public trust in institutions that have already lost too much credibility. To the historians and journalists who will investigate these claims, be careful, be thorough, be brave. The people who killed witnesses and destroyed evidence may be gone, but the systems they created to protect state secrets remain in place. Truth-telling is still a dangerous profession in America. To Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, wherever your final resting places may be, your story is finally being told. Your truth is finally being spoken. Your silence is finally being broken. You escaped from Alcatraz on June 11th, 1962. You survived the waters of San Francisco Bay. You lived beyond that night, whatever your ultimate fates may have been. History will remember you not as the criminals who failed to escape, but as the men who succeeded too well for the government's comfort. Your greatest escape wasn't from prison. It was from the official narrative that tried to erase you from history. That escape, at least, was permanent. Final statement for the record. I, Detective Raymond Kowalski, being of sound mind and facing imminent death, do hereby swear under oath that every statement in this recording and its accompanying documents represents the truth as I discovered it through my official investigation into the Alcatraz escape of 1962. I have knowingly risked my career, my safety, and my life to preserve this information. I have done so not for personal gain or professional advancement, but because I believe that in a democracy, truth belongs to the people, not to the bureaucrats who find it inconvenient. If my death occurs under suspicious circumstances, if these documents are somehow suppressed or discredited, if this recording mysteriously disappears, let it stand as evidence that the cover-up I've documented continues to claim lives. But if this message reaches you intact, if the truth I've preserved finally sees daylight, then maybe, just maybe, the strongest prison of all has finally been breached. The silence is broken, the truth is free, and Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers can finally rest in peace, knowing their story has been told.